The decision to fly commercial had been Rebecca Torres's own. Her assistant had questioned it politely the way Melissa Barnes
It's all right.
questioned
We've
everything
got you.
that deviated from
We'll
protocol.
get this sorted out for you.
But Rebecca had
Is
been
everything
firm.
okay here?
The Gulfstream could stay grounded. She would take Tech Air 447 to San Francisco like any other passenger, because the only way to understand what her customers experienced was to live it herself. 6 years of building Torres Aviation Technologies into a $4.7 billion empire, and she still remembered the hospital social worker's face when Rebecca had asked about accessible air travel options. The pity had been worse than the prognosis. That look, the one that said your life just got smaller, had fueled more innovation than any business school case study ever could. Now, at 30, Rebecca moved through Hartsfield-Jackson Atlanta International with practiced efficiency. November mornings in Georgia carried a specific quality of cold, the kind that made metal hand controls sting against bare palms. She'd worn gloves, small adaptations learned through trial and countless errors. The prosthetic leg beneath her dark jeans was the most advanced model her own engineering team had produced, responsive enough that most people never noticed the slight asymmetry in her gait. The forearm crutches were medical-grade aluminum grip tape worn smooth from 6 years of constant use. Boarding Group A was called. Rebecca waited for the rush to pass, then made her way down the jetway. The gate agent's smile held that particular brightness reserved for wheelchair users and the visibly different, overcompensating kindness that somehow felt like its own category of dismissal. Seat 14C aisle as always. Window seats meant climbing over strangers, meant asking for help, meant drawing attention to the mechanics of her body in ways that made everyone uncomfortable. The aisle offered autonomy, or at least the illusion of it. The overhead bin was full by the time she reached her row. Rebecca looked up at the compartment, calculating angles. Her crutches needed to go somewhere. Standing on the prosthetic without support was possible for short durations, but turbulence made fools of even the most confident amputees. A flight attendant materialized at her elbow. Brandon, according to his name tag. 27, maybe 28, with the kind of styled blonde hair that required product and a mirror. His smile was professional, his eyes less so. They'd already cataloged her crutches, her uneven stance, the entire architecture of her difference. "Let me help you with those." His hand reached for the crutches before she could respond. "I can manage, just need space in the bin." "Oh, we have a special storage area up front for medical equipment. It's safer there." The words came out practiced, scripted. He'd said this before to other passengers, other bodies that didn't conform to Boeing's standardized dimensions. "These aren't medical equipment. They're mobility aids. I need them accessible." Something flickered across Brandon's face, not quite annoyance, but close. A second flight attendant joined them, Kevin, according to his name tag, broader in the shoulders with the confident posture of someone who'd never had to negotiate his right to exist in a space. "Is there a problem?" Kevin directed the question to Brandon, not Rebecca. "Just trying to help the passenger with her special needs." The phrase landed like a slap. Special needs. As if requiring basic accessibility made her less than whole, less than capable, less than worthy of the ordinary frustrations of overhead bin Tetris that plagued every commercial flight. "I don't have special needs. I need to store my crutches where I can reach them. That's not special. That's practical." Brandon's smile tightened. He reached into the overhead compartment and pulled out a black roller bag, shifting things with deliberate inefficiency. When he finally created space, it was at the very back of the bin, a position that would require standing on tiptoe to access. Rebecca was 5'6" on her best day. On the prosthetic, balance was a negotiation, not a guarantee. "There you go. All set." Brandon's tone suggested the conversation was finished. Rebecca handed up her crutches. He took them with exaggerated care as if they might shatter, then wedged them into the space he'd created, too far back. She wouldn't be able to reach them without help. "Those need to be closer to the front." "I'm sorry, but this is the only available space. FAA regulations require all items to be properly stowed." The smile never wavered, but his eyes had gone flat. Kevin stood beside him, a wall of matching navy blazers and manufactured courtesy. Other passengers squeezed past, shooting glances that ranged from sympathetic to irritated. The boarding process was stalling. Rebecca was becoming an obstacle, a problem to be solved or circumvented. She knew this dance, had performed it in conference rooms and investor meetings on city sidewalks and in restaurant restrooms. The world was built for bodies that worked in specific ways, and hers no longer qualified. She settled into 14C and tried to ignore the tightness in her chest. 35,000 feet of upcoming vulnerability, and her primary means of independent movement was locked in a compartment she couldn't access without assistance. The seatbelt clicked home. Around her, the plane filled with the usual chaos of carry-ons and competing claims to armrest territory. 2 rows back, a man slid into 16B with the economical movements of someone accustomed to confined spaces. James Walker was 32 years old and looked older, not in his face that remained relatively unlined despite a decade of service and 2 years of grinding civilian struggle, but in his eyes. The kind of exhaustion that sleep couldn't touch, that came from carrying weight no visible burden could explain. He wore jeans and a flannel shirt that had been pulled straight from the dryer, wrinkled but clean. Work boots still carried traces of the hydraulic fluid he'd spent the last 30 hours cleaning from a hangar floor after an equipment failure at Walker Ground Services had turned what should have been a routine maintenance shift into an all-night crisis. The contract had specified a 24-hour turnaround. James had delivered in 18 because his father had taught him that reputation was built in the margins between adequate and exceptional. The margins were getting narrower. 60 days until foreclosure. $180,000 in debt, medical bills from Angela's birth, business loans taken when optimism had seemed like strategy, the accumulated weight of trying to maintain his father's legacy on revenue that barely covered payroll. George Mitchell, his father's right hand for 3 decades, had looked at the books last week and gone silent in a way that said more than spreadsheets ever could. James closed his eyes against the headache building behind his temples. The shoulder ached, a deep throb that predicted weather better than any forecast. Shrapnel from an improvised explosive device in Fallujah had left him with a purple heart and nerve damage that no amount of VA physical therapy could fully resolve. The medical discharge at 30 had felt like failure, even though his team leader had assured him otherwise. SEALs didn't quit. They were released only when their bodies made continuing impossible. So he'd come home to Atlanta, to the ground services company his father had built from a single tow truck and a lot of sweat. Walker Ground Services had never made anyone rich, but it had put food on tables and sent kids to college. Now it was bleeding out slowly, victim of larger competitors with deeper pockets and James's own inexperience in corporate warfare. Angela was waiting at home. 8 years old, brilliant and curious, with her mother's eyes and an engineering mind that asked questions James couldn't always answer. She wanted to be an aerospace engineer, wanted to design the next generation of spacecraft, wanted to touch Mars, wanted to reach beyond the atmosphere that had killed her mother through catastrophic hemorrhage and pulmonary embolism during an emergency C-section James had authorized while deployed 8,000 miles away. He'd missed the birth, missed the death, had arrived home to a daughter who didn't know him and a grave that did. The plane jerked into motion, taxiing toward the runway. James opened his eyes and found himself watching the woman in 14C. She sat with the particular stillness of someone managing pain or discomfort, hands folded in her lap, auburn hair falling forward to partially obscure her profile. Professional clothes, charcoal slacks, a cream silk blouse under a tailored jacket. The kind of outfit that cost more than James's monthly grocery budget. The flight attendants moved through the cabin, performing their scripted safety demonstration. James had logged enough commercial flights during his military career to recite the speech from memory. Seat cushions as flotation devices. Oxygen masks dropping from overhead compartments. The nearest exit might be behind you. He saw the moment Brandon stopped beside 14C. Saw the woman Rebecca, though James didn't know her name yet, look up with an expression carefully neutral. "Would you like something to drink before takeoff?" "Orange juice, please." Brandon returned moments later with a plastic cup filled to the brim. Too full. He handed it to Rebecca with a carelessness that might have been accidental, might have been deliberate. Physics made its own determination. The cup tilted as it transferred from his hand to hers, and orange juice arced across her lap, soaking into the expensive fabric of her slacks, turning the cream silk blouse transparent where liquid splashed upward. Papers scattered from her tray table contract negotiations, judging by the dense legal text James glimpsed before they hit the floor. The juice spread across printed pages, rendering ink illegible. "Oh, wow, I'm so sorry about that." Brandon's voice carried no actual apology. Kevin appeared with napkins, both of them hovering as Rebecca tried to contain the damage with movements restricted by the seatbelt and the limited range of motion the aircraft allowed. Passengers nearby looked up, then away. The universal human response to someone else's humiliation acknowledgement, followed by studied ignorance. Easier to pretend not to see than to intervene. James felt his jaw tighten. He recognized the dynamic unfolding 2 rows ahead, had seen it in 100 different contexts, different countries, different circumstances. Predators selecting prey. The vulnerable identified and isolated. Rebecca managed to blot most of the liquid from her clothes, but the silk was ruined, the documents destroyed. She bent to retrieve the papers, and James saw the way she calculated the movement. The angle required the balance, needed the assistance she'd require from the armrest to leverage herself back upright. "Probably hard for you to get down there, huh?" Kevin's voice carried across the cabin loud enough to ensure an audience. "Want me to grab those for you?" The offer itself was innocuous. The tone was not. It carried mockery wrapped in helpfulness, the particular cruelty of those who'd never questioned their own physical autonomy. "I can manage." Rebecca's voice stayed level, but James heard the strain underneath. Brandon crouched in the aisle gathering papers with exaggerated care. When he stood, he handed them back to Rebecca in a dripping stack. "Guess you'll need someone to clean that up. Oh, wait." He gestured vaguely at her legs, the motion implying limitations James suspected had nothing to do with actual capability and everything to do with assumed helplessness. Kevin laughed. The sound scraped against James's nerves like metal on metal. The plane reached its position in the takeoff queue. Engines spooled up that particular whine of turbines building thrust. James made himself breathe slowly. In through the nose, 4 count. Hold 4 count. Out through the mouth, 4 count. The rhythm his therapist had taught him for managing the moments when civilian life felt like a poorly fitting uniform he'd never learned to wear correctly. "Not your problem." The thought arrived with the voice of his team leader, pragmatic and distant. "Stay in your lane. Don't create complications." But James had never been particularly good at staying in his lane. That was why he'd volunteered for SEAL training at 19. Why he'd taken point on operations other operators avoided. Why he'd come home from war and immediately assumed responsibility for a failing business and a daughter who deserved better than an absent father consumed by debt and nightmares. The plane accelerated down the runway, physics pressing passengers back into seats designed for bodies that conformed to statistical averages. Rebecca sat motionless, staring straight ahead, and James recognized the expression. He'd worn it himself often enough. The face you showed the world when allowing genuine emotion would constitute surrender. Wheels left tarmac. Atlanta fell away beneath them, city spreading out in morning light that turned windows into scattered mirrors. The seatbelt sign remained illuminated. Brandon and Kevin disappeared into the forward galley, their laughter audible even over the engine noise. James closed his eyes and tried to sleep. Failed. The shoulder throbbed. The headache had become a vice. 60 days until foreclosure. Angela's school tuition due in 3 weeks. George's unspoken concern hanging over every conversation like smoke. 30 minutes into the flight, the seatbelt sign chimed off. Passengers began the familiar dance of reclining seats and retrieving laptops. James stayed still, conserving energy he couldn't afford to waste. Movement in his peripheral vision. Brandon and Kevin emerging from the galley, pushing the beverage cart. They worked their way down the aisle with practiced efficiency, dispensing drinks and packaged snacks. Normal service. Unremarkable except for the moment they reached 14C. Rebecca ordered coffee. Brandon poured it with the same careless motion he'd used for the orange juice, but this time Rebecca was ready. She accepted the cup with both hands, steadying it against the small tray table. "Black coffee for the lady." Kevin's emphasis on the word carried subtle mockery. "Sure you don't need help with that? Wouldn't want any more accidents." "I'm fine." The words came out clipped. "Must be difficult traveling alone." Do you have someone meeting you in San Francisco, family, maybe? Brandon leaned against the seat back across the aisle, too casual, too familiar. That's not your concern. Just trying to be friendly. We get training on how to help passengers with special needs. Want to make sure you're comfortable. The smile stayed fixed, but his eyes had gone cold. James felt something shift in his chest. Not anger yet, but the precursor to it, a tightening that preceded action, the way thunder preceded lightning. Kevin pulled something from the overhead bin above Rebecca's seat. Her crutches. He examined them with exaggerated interest, turning the aluminum tubes in his hands like artifacts from an unfamiliar civilization. These things are kind of cool, actually. How much weight can they hold? Like, could a normal person use them, or are they special equipment? The word normal landed like a stone. Rebecca's hands tightened on the coffee cup. James watched the tendons stand out on the backs of her hands, watched her knuckles go white. Please put those back. Oh, sure, just curious. Kevin made a show of returning the crutches to the overhead bin, but his movements were deliberately awkward. One crutch slipped from his grasp, and he caught it with theatrical flourish. Whoops! Good thing these are sturdy. The beverage cart moved forward. Brandon and Kevin continued down the aisle, leaving Rebecca sitting in a spreading pool of humiliation that no napkin could absorb. James found himself standing before conscious thought caught up to muscle memory. 10 years of training had carved pathways in his nervous system that civilian life couldn't erase. Identify threat. Assess vulnerability. Eliminate danger. The sequence happened faster than logic. Faster than the internal voice that counseled caution and non-involvement. He moved into the aisle 3 rows in a lifetime of certainty carrying him forward. Excuse me. His voice came out lower than intended, roughened by 30 hours without sleep and 2 years of swallowing rage at a world that seemed designed to punish decency. Brandon turned, eyebrows raised. Yes, sir. I need you to return this passenger's mobility aids to a position she can actually access. Silence spread outward from James's words. Nearby passengers looked up from phones and magazines. Kevin abandoned the beverage cart and walked back, positioning himself beside Brandon in unconscious territorial display. I'm sorry, sir, but the items are properly stowed according to FAA regulations. If the passenger needs assistance during the flight, we're happy to help. James had dealt with bureaucratic evasion in a dozen countries in situations where lives hung on the difference between policy and practice. He recognized the game. Make the rules so burdensome that compliance became its own punishment, then offer assistance as if it were generosity rather than obligation. FAA regulations require items to be stowed safely. They don't require them to be stowed inaccessibly. Move them forward in the bin. Sir, I'm going to have to ask you to return to your seat. You're interfering with our ability to serve other passengers. I'll return to my seat after you correct the problem. Kevin's posture shifted, shoulders squaring. He had 4 inches and 40 pounds on James, the kind of size advantage that mattered in confrontations between civilians. He'd probably never been in a real fight, never faced someone trained to disable opponents twice his size using leverage and speed instead of strength. There's no problem here except the one you're creating. This passenger is being accommodated according to company policy. James glanced at Rebecca. She sat frozen, watching the confrontation unfold with an expression caught between gratitude and horror. This wasn't what she'd wanted. She'd been trying to manage the situation quietly to minimize conflict to survive the flight with her dignity intact. But James had seen too many people try to minimize themselves into safety, had watched the strong prey on the weak, while everyone else maintained polite silence. His sister had been paralyzed from the waist down after a car accident when James was deployed in Afghanistan. He'd been halfway around the world when it happened, unable to help, unable to protect, unable to do anything except listen to her voice on scratchy satellite connections as she described the way strangers stared, the way accessibility was treated as special accommodation rather than basic human right. He'd promised himself then that he would never look away when it happened in front of him. I saw you spill orange juice on her, saw you make jokes about her mobility, saw you pull her crutches from the overhead bin to examine them like toys. That's not accommodation, that's harassment." The words came out harder than James intended, sharpened by exhaustion and the particular fury that came from witnessing cruelty performed as entertainment. Brandon's smile finally cracked. "Sir, I'm going to have to call the captain." "Call him. I'll wait." The standoff stretched. Other passengers had abandoned any pretense of disinterest. A woman across the aisle held her phone at an angle that suggested she was recording. The beverage cart sat abandoned in the middle of the cabin, blocking movement in either direction. Kevin made his decision. His hand shot out toward James's shoulder, a push meant to move him backward, reassert dominance through physical contact. Mistake. James's body reacted before his brain could override muscle memory carved by 10,000 hours of close-quarters combat training. His left hand came up, intercepting Kevin's wrist with precision that looked effortless because it was automatic. Controlled redirection of force using the flight attendant's own momentum against him. Not a strike, not quite, but enough pressure on specific nerve clusters to make Kevin's arm go slack. The motion took less than 2 seconds. Kevin found himself off balance, bent slightly forward, his right arm locked in a grip that appeared gentle but prevented any effective resistance. Brandon's face drained of color. He'd probably never seen someone move like that. No telegraph, no wind-up, just sudden, absolute control. James released Kevin's wrist and stepped back, hands raised in universal gesture of non-aggression. His heart hammered against his ribs. The headache had vanished, replaced by the crystalline focus that came with adrenaline and the terrible clarity of having crossed a line he couldn't uncross. "Touch me again and this gets worse." The words came out flat, factual, not a threat, a statement of cause and effect. Kevin backed away, cradling his wrist. Brandon remained frozen, calculating odds and outcomes. The cabin had gone absolutely silent. Even the engine noise seemed muted, as if the aircraft itself held its breath. The cockpit door opened. The captain emerged, a man in his 50s with silver hair and the kind of weathered face that came from 30 years of making decisions at altitude. His gaze swept the scene. James standing in the aisle. Brandon and Kevin, clearly rattled passengers, watching with phones raised. Rebecca still sitting in 14C with coffee cooling in her hands. "What's happening here?" Brandon found his voice first. "This passenger assaulted my colleague. We need law enforcement to meet the aircraft in San Francisco." The captain's expression didn't change. He looked at Kevin. "Are you injured?" He grabbed my wrist. "Are you injured?" Silence. Kevin's wrist showed no marks, no bruising, no visible damage because James had been careful not to cause any. Control, not harm. The distinction mattered. "No, sir." The captain shifted his attention to James. "What's your version?" "I asked these flight attendants to make this passenger's mobility aids accessible. They refused. One of them put his hands on me first. I defended myself." "He's lying," Brandon started. "I have video." The woman across the aisle held up her phone, started recording when they were harassing the woman with the crutches, got everything. The captain's jaw tightened. He looked at Rebecca for the first time. "Ma'am, do you need medical attention?" "No, I'm fine." The words came out quiet but steady. "Did these flight attendants harass you?" Rebecca hesitated. James recognized the calculation happening behind her eyes. Confirm the story and make herself the center of an official incident. Deny it and let the harassment stand unchallenged. No good options, just varying degrees of consequence. "Yes." The single word carried weight. The captain nodded once, decision made. He turned to Brandon and Kevin. "Both of you galley. Now, I'll deal with you after we land." To James, "Return to your seat. Don't move again unless the plane's on fire." "Yes, sir." The captain's gaze lingered on James for another moment, and James saw recognition there. Military to military. The silent acknowledgement that passed between people who understood chain of command and the weight of decisions made in compressed time frames. Then the moment passed, and the captain returned to the cockpit door, sealing behind him with a definitive click. Brandon and Kevin retreated to the galley. The woman with the phone gave James a subtle thumbs up before returning to her seat. Conversations resumed throughout the cabin, muted, but present the ambient noise of judgment and speculation. James walked back to 16B on legs that had started to shake. Adrenaline dump inevitable and familiar. His hands trembled as he fastened the seatbelt. The shoulder throbbed with renewed intensity, nerve endings firing protest at movements they were no longer designed to accommodate. What had he done? Laid hands on a civilian. Used force. Demonstrated capability that marked him as dangerous, unstable, exactly the kind of veteran people crossed the street to avoid. Angela's school would hear about this. George would hear. The bank would hear. One more piece of evidence that James Walker couldn't control himself, couldn't function in normal society, couldn't be trusted with responsibility. 60 days until foreclosure, and he'd just given the world another reason to write him off. The flight attendant call button chimed. James looked up to see Rebecca's hand on the button above 14C. A different flight attendant appeared, older, female, clearly senior staff. Brief conversation James couldn't hear, then the woman reached into the overhead bin and retrieved Rebecca's crutches, placing them within easy reach. Rebecca turned in her seat. Her eyes found James's across 2 rows and an aisle. She mouthed 2 words, "Thank you." James nodded, throat too tight for speech. The remaining hours of the flight passed in manufactured normalcy. A third flight attendant took over beverage service. Brandon and Kevin remained invisible in the galley, presumably receiving whatever reprimand the captain deemed appropriate. Passengers returned to their laptops and magazines, the incident already fading into anecdote, something to share over dinner about the crazy flight where a guy almost fought the crew. James stared at the seat back in front of him and tried not to think about consequences. Failed. His mind cataloged potential outcomes with the thoroughness that had kept him alive through 4 deployments. Best case, nothing happened beyond a report filed and forgotten. Worst case, assault charges, legal fees he couldn't afford, custody questions about Angela, ammunition for the bank's attorneys arguing he was unstable and unfit to run a business. Somewhere between best and worst lay the probable outcome. Uncomfortable questions, official scrutiny, the slow accumulation of complications in a life already drowning in them. The plane began its descent into San Francisco. Flight attendants performed final safety checks. Rebecca had changed into a sweater from her carry-on, the ruined blouse hidden away. She sat with her hands folded on the tray table, gaze fixed on something beyond the window. Wheels touched down with the characteristic chirp of rubber on concrete. Thrust reversers engaged, and the aircraft decelerated through a world of gray fog and morning drizzle. San Francisco in November looked like every other major airport, terminals and taxiways, service vehicles, and distant mountains obscured by marine layer. The plane parked at the gate. The seatbelt sign chimed off. Passengers stood with choreographed impatience, retrieving bags and checking phones. James remained seated, unwilling to join the crush, unwilling to draw more attention than he'd already attracted. Rebecca stood testing balance on the prosthetic before reaching for her crutches. James saw the way she moved, economical, practiced, each motion calculated to minimize vulnerability. She pulled a carry-on from the overhead compartment with the fluid efficiency of someone who'd learned to manage weight and leverage through trial and pain. The aisle cleared slowly. Rebecca made her way forward with the cautious speed of someone navigating an obstacle course designed without them in mind. She paused beside 16B. "I didn't get your name." "James Walker." "Rebecca Torres." She shifted one crutch to extend her hand. James shook it, her grip firm, her palm cool against his. "You didn't have to do that. But thank you." "Anyone would have—" "No." The word came out sharp, certain. "They wouldn't. They didn't." She glanced towards the front of the plane where Brandon and Kevin were presumably still sequestered. "People see it happening and look away because getting involved is complicated. You didn't look away." James had no response to that, so he said nothing. Rebecca studied him for a moment longer, and James had the uncomfortable sense of being evaluated, measured against criteria he didn't understand. "Are you in San Francisco for business?" "Just passing through." "I work here." She pulled a business card from her jacket pocket and handed it to him. Simple design, expensive cardstock. "Rebecca Torres, CEO, Torres Aviation Technologies. A San Francisco address in the financial district. Email and phone number in understated font." James stared at the card, recalibrating everything. CEO. Billion-dollar company. He'd heard of Torres Aviation. Their accessibility innovations had been featured in trade publications. George insisted James read. The woman he'd defended wasn't just a passenger enduring harassment. She was someone with resources and influence that made his own struggling business look like a lemonade stand. I didn't know. Of course you didn't. That's why it matters. Rebecca's smile carried complexity James couldn't parse. If you're ever in the area and want coffee, my assistant can make time. It's the least I can do. She didn't wait for his response. The aisle had cleared and she moved forward with the same careful efficiency, disappearing into the jetway. James sat in the empty aircraft and looked at the business card. Raised lettering caught the overhead lights, creating shadows that made the text seem three-dimensional. Torres Aviation Technologies, CEO. What were the odds of all the flights, all the seats, all the possible configurations of chance and circumstance? He'd ended up 2 rows behind someone who operated in a world so far removed from his own, they might as well have been different species. The card went into his wallet. James retrieved his duffel from the overhead bin and made his way off the plane. The jetway smelled like recycled air and industrial carpet cleaner. Gate area beyond was standard-issue airport terminal CNN playing on mounted screens, passengers checking departure boards, the ambient noise of transit and temporary presence. His phone buzzed. Text from George: call when you land. Need to discuss the Atlantic Aviation contract. Atlantic Aviation was one of their few remaining major clients, a regional carrier that had stayed loyal through Walker Ground Services' lean years. If they were making noises about renegotiating terms, James was in deeper trouble than he'd thought. He found a quiet corner near a closed gate and dialed George's number. James, where are you? San Francisco, just landed. What's happening with Atlantic? George's sigh carried through the connection, weighted with all the conversations they'd avoided having for months. They want to talk about pricing. Got a bid from Thornton Aero Services that undercuts us by 30%. James closed his eyes. Richard Thornton. His father's old rival, the man who'd spent 20 years trying to eliminate Walker Ground Services through strategic contracts and predatory pricing. The feud was older than James's military career, rooted in some business dispute from decades past that both men had carried like inherited grudges. We can't match 30%. The margins don't exist. I know. But if we lose Atlantic, we lose 12% of our revenue. Bank's not going to extend the loan with numbers like that. 60 days until foreclosure. Now maybe 45, maybe 30, depending on how fast Thornton moved and how willing Atlantic was to value loyalty over cost. I'll be back tomorrow. We'll figure something out. James? George's voice carried the weight of 3 decades watching businesses fail. Sometimes figuring it out means acknowledging when you're beaten. Your father would understand. My father built this company from nothing. I'm not the one who buries it. The words came out harsher than intended. George had been there when James's father collapsed in the hangar office, massive coronary that killed him before the ambulance arrived. Had been there for the funeral, for the reading of the will, for every crisis since. He deserved better than James's defensive anger. Sorry, I'm tired. I know you are, son. Get some sleep. We'll talk when you're home. The call ended. James stood in the anonymous space of an airport terminal 2,000 miles from everything that mattered and felt the full weight of his situation settle across his shoulders. Failing business, mounting debt, a daughter who deserved stability he couldn't provide. And now fresh complications from a confrontation on an airplane that might or might not result in legal consequences. The business card in his wallet felt like it was burning through the leather. Rebecca Torres, CEO. She'd offered coffee as if that meant something, as if people from her world casually invited mechanics from Atlanta to corporate headquarters for social calls. It didn't mean anything. Couldn't. She was being polite, acknowledging the intervention with the kind of gesture rich people made when they wanted to feel magnanimous. James would return to Georgia, the card would gather dust in his wallet, and eventually he'd throw it away when it seemed pathetic to keep carrying evidence of a 5-minute conversation with someone so far beyond his reach, she might as well have been fictional. The smart thing would be to forget the entire flight happened. James had never been particularly smart about knowing when to let things go. He found the airport shuttle to his hotel, a budget chain near the financial district, where he'd scheduled meetings with equipment suppliers who might offer better terms than what he was currently locked into. Long-shot economics, the kind of desperation math that happened when you started measuring success in months instead of years. The hotel room was exactly what he'd paid for, clean, basic, depressing in its functionality. James dropped the duffel on the bed and stared at the bland landscape painting above the headboard. Generic coastal scene waves frozen in acrylic, utterly devoid of anything that might provoke emotion or thought. His phone buzzed. Text from Angela. "Miss you, Daddy. Mr. Harrison says we're starting propulsion systems next week in science." The message came with a photo, Angela grinning at the camera holding a model rocket she'd been building her hair in the braids she'd learned to do herself because James was terrible at anything requiring fine motor control and patience. He typed back, "That's amazing, baby. Can't wait to hear all about it. Home tomorrow night. Love you." 3 dots appeared, disappeared, appeared again. Then, "Love you too, Daddy. Don't work too hard." The screen went dark. James sat on the edge of the bed and felt something crack in his chest, some last bit of armor that had been holding back the full weight of everything he was failing to protect. Angela deserved better than a father who couldn't keep the lights on, who snapped at elderly advisors, who nearly got arrested for defending strangers on airplanes. She deserved the world, and he was giving her the wreckage of something that had stopped working long before he'd inherited it. The business card sat on the nightstand where he'd emptied his pockets. Rebecca Torres, CEO, Torres Aviation Technologies. James picked it up, studying the raised letters in lamplight that turned the card's edges into tiny shadows. She'd said to call if he was in the area. Had meant it as courtesy, probably. The kind of thing you said to strangers who did you a favor knowing they'd never actually follow through. But what if she'd meant it as something else? What if there was even a 5% chance that someone with her resources and reach might have use for someone with his background and desperation? The thought felt absurd, even forming. CEOs of billion-dollar companies didn't hire failing mechanics because they'd broken up a confrontation on a commercial flight. That wasn't how the world worked. Merit and desperation weren't currency in boardrooms and executive suites. Except Rebecca Torres hadn't built a $4.7 billion accessibility technology company by following conventional wisdom. Her entire business model was predicated on seeing value where others saw limitation, on investing in solutions the market insisted were impossible. James pulled out his phone and stared at the card for a long moment. Then he typed her name into the search bar. The results loaded instantly. Forbes profile, TechCrunch features, a Wall Street Journal piece from 3 months ago about Torres Aviation's latest accessibility innovations, and buried in the 4th page of results, a personal profile from a disability advocacy magazine. He clicked the link and started reading. The article was 2 years old, written shortly after Torres Aviation had broken into the Fortune 500. It covered the accident, the car crash that had taken her leg and nearly her life, the boyfriend who'd left her during recovery, the hospital bed sketches that had become patent applications, then prototypes, then products that generated hundreds of millions in revenue. One quote jumped out, "People kept telling me to adjust my expectations, to accept limitations, to be realistic about what was possible. I decided that anyone who thought amputation meant the end of ambition didn't understand the difference between limitation and challenge. Limitations are absolute. Challenges are just problems waiting for better solutions." James read the sentence 3 times, felt something shift in his understanding of the woman who'd handed him her card. She hadn't offered coffee out of polite obligation. She'd offered it because she recognized something, saw capability where others saw complication, understood that the most interesting solutions came from people who'd been forced to rebuild everything from the ground up. Or maybe he was projecting. Reading meaning into courtesy because he desperately needed there to be meaning, needed to believe that someone might see him as more than the sum of his failures. The hotel room's heating unit cycled on with a rattle that suggested mechanical problems James could diagnose but wasn't being paid to fix. Outside the window, San Francisco sprawled in sodium vapor amber city of second acts and reinvention built on gold rush dreams and technological revolution. James set the business card on the nightstand and tried to sleep. Failed. The shoulder ached. His mind replayed the confrontation with Brandon and Kevin, cataloging every moment where different choices might have produced better outcomes. The smart play would have been staying seated, minding his business, letting someone else intervene, or more likely letting the harassment continue unchallenged. But James had stopped making smart plays around the same time he'd volunteered for SEAL training at 19. The smart play was safety. He'd spent his adult life walking toward danger because someone had to, and he'd been trained to be that someone. Now he was trained for nothing that mattered in the civilian world. Couldn't make payroll. Couldn't compete with corporations that had legal teams and pricing strategies designed to destroy smaller competitors. Couldn't sleep through the night without dreams that mixed hydraulic fluid with blood that turned Angela's laughter into screams he hadn't been there to prevent. 3 a.m. arrived with the special clarity of exhaustion and too much thinking. James gave up on sleep and opened his laptop. The equipment supplier meetings were scheduled for later that morning, and he hadn't finished reviewing the contracts George had forwarded. The numbers were brutal. Every quote came in higher than current costs because Walker Ground Services didn't have volume to negotiate bulk pricing. Catch-22 economics couldn't grow without better equipment, couldn't afford better equipment without growth. His email inbox held the usual accumulation of vendor invoices and past due notices. One message stood out marked urgent from the bank's commercial lending department. James opened it with the dread that came from knowing exactly what it would say. Mr. Walker. This letter serves as formal notice that Walker Ground Services, LLC, has failed to meet minimum revenue requirements as specified in Section 4.2b of your business loan agreement. Per the terms of said agreement, the lending institution reserves the right to demand immediate repayment of outstanding principal $180,000 plus accrued interest, $8,450 if monthly revenue falls below established thresholds for 3 consecutive quarters. Your account is now registered below threshold revenue for Q2, Q3, and Q4 of the current fiscal year. You have 60 days from the date of this letter to either A. bring the account current with full payment of principal and interest, or B. demonstrate sustained revenue improvement sufficient to meet contractual obligations. Failure to satisfy these requirements will result in foreclosure proceedings and liquidation of collateral assets. The rest was legal boilerplate, the formal language of institutions destroying individual lives through policy and procedure. James closed the laptop before he could read the signature. 60 days. Not negotiable, not subject to appeals based on effort or intention. Math didn't care about Angela's tuition or George's pension or the legacy of a man who'd built something meaningful from nothing. 4 a.m. James dressed in the same clothes he'd worn on the flight and left the hotel. San Francisco's financial district was deserted at that hour, office towers rising like monuments to capital and ambition. His breath misted in the cold. Somewhere in one of these buildings, Rebecca Torres probably had an office with views that made his entire world look like a rounding error. He walked until the sky started to lighten, until his legs ached and the shoulders throb had become white noise. Found himself standing outside a building whose directory listed Torres Aviation Technologies on floors 20 through 28. The lobby was locked dark except for security lighting. James stared at his reflection in the glass doors. 32 years old and looking older, dressed in wrinkled flannel and work boots, staring at a world he had no business entering. The business card was still in his wallet. Her personal cell number was right there, probably disconnected from her actual phone at this hour, but still possibly real, possibly answered, possibly a door that hadn't fully closed. James pulled out his phone and typed a message he had no intention of sending Ms. Torres. You said to reach out if I wanted coffee. I'm in San Francisco until tomorrow. If the offer stands, I'd appreciate the conversation. James Walker. His finger hovered over the send button. This was insane. CEOs didn't respond to messages from strangers at 4:30 in the morning. Didn't waste time on mechanics from Atlanta who brought nothing to the table except failing businesses and too much baggage. The message sat unsent as dawn broke over San Francisco, turning the city from amber to gray to gold. James stood outside Torres Aviation Technologies and tried to decide if hope was courage or just another form of surrender. In 14 hours he'd be on a plane back to Atlanta. Back to George's worried silence and Angela's trusting questions, and the countdown to foreclosure that measured time in heartbeats and missed opportunities. He hit send before rational thought could override desperation. The message disappeared into digital infrastructure, carrying with it the last fragile possibility that someone might see value in the wreckage. Then James walked back to his hotel, attended his supplier meetings with vendors who quoted prices he couldn't afford, and waited for a response that almost certainly would never come. Rebecca's phone vibrated at 4:47 in the morning, pulling her from sleep that had been tentative at best. The message preview glowed in the darkness of her Nob Hill bedroom, sender name unfamiliar until her brain made the connection. James Walker, the veteran from the flight. She sat up reading the full text. Professional distance warred with curiosity. CEOs didn't typically respond to messages from strangers at this hour, didn't rearrange schedules based on airport encounters and business cards handed out in moments of gratitude. But Rebecca had built Torres Aviation Technologies by trusting instincts that conventional wisdom insisted were foolish, by seeing potential in spaces the market had written off as unprofitable. Her fingers moved before caution could intervene. I'm awake. Coffee at 8 a.m. There's a place called Presidio Grounds near my office. I'll text you the address. The response came within seconds. I'll be there. Thank you. Rebecca set the phone down and stared at the ceiling. She'd had Stephen Hayes, her head of security, run a preliminary background check on James Walker during the flight standard protocol for anyone who demonstrated the kind of controlled violence she'd witnessed. Former SEAL Team 5. Purple Heart recipient. Honorable discharge following combat injuries. Owner of a struggling ground services company in Atlanta with 60 days until foreclosure. That last detail had caught her attention. Desperation made people dangerous, but it also made them motivated in ways that comfortable security never could. She'd been desperate once, sketching accessibility innovations on hospital napkins while learning to walk again, while her ex-boyfriend's voice still echoed with all the reasons loving someone with a prosthetic leg was more burden than he'd signed up for. Desperation had built her empire. Maybe it could build something else. The preliminary idea had formed during the flight, crystallizing as she'd watched James return to his seat with trembling hands and the particular stillness of someone fighting adrenaline dump. Torres Aviation needed ground service partners across the Southeast. Needed people who understood both technical excellence and human dignity, who wouldn't treat accessibility as afterthought or burden. More than that, and this was the part Rebecca hadn't shared with her board yet, she needed proof of concept for a new business model. Veteran-owned partnerships with technology integration and community investment. Show the market that doing good and doing well weren't mutually exclusive, that investing in people the system had discarded generated returns conventional metrics couldn't measure. James Walker might be exactly the test case she needed. Or he might be a veteran with PTSD and anger management issues who'd add complications to a quarterly report that already had board members questioning her judgment. Only one way to find out. Rebecca showered and dressed with particular care, charcoal suit, minimal jewelry, the prosthetic leg calibrated for maximum stability. Presentations to strangers always meant managing perceptions, answering questions people were too polite to ask directly. She'd learned to control the narrative through competence and careful staging. Presidio Grounds occupied a converted warehouse in the financial district, all exposed brick and industrial lighting. Rebecca arrived 15 minutes early and claimed a corner table with sight lines to the entrance. Old habits from her sister's security briefings, always know who's coming through the door. James walked in at 7:58 wearing the same flannel shirt from the flight, though he'd clearly tried to press it. The effect was endearing in its futility. He scanned the space with automatic threat assessment gaze, cataloging exits and blind spots before finding Rebecca. Their eyes met across the coffee shop, and Rebecca felt the same jolt of recognition she'd experienced on the plane. Not attraction exactly, something more complex, the sense of seeing a reflection in an unexpected mirror, of recognizing damage that matched her own. He approached with controlled movements that suggested injury compensated for through will. The shoulder, probably. Stephen's report had mentioned shrapnel damage. Ms. Torres? Rebecca, please. She gestured to the chair across from her. "Coffee's my treat. Consider it combat pay for dealing with Brandon and Kevin." A ghost of a smile crossed his face. "James, and you don't owe me anything." "I disagree, but we can argue about it later. What do you want?" "Black coffee, large." Rebecca placed the order at the counter, then returned with 2 oversized mugs and a plate of pastries she had no intention of eating, but knew made the meeting look more social than transactional. James wrapped both hands around the coffee like he was trying to warm them, though the shop was perfectly heated. Nervous gesture, maybe, or just exhaustion. He had the particular gray quality that came from too many nights without real sleep. "You didn't have to respond to that message. I shouldn't have sent it." The self-deprecation activated something protective in Rebecca's chest. She'd heard that tone in her own voice during the months after the accident, when every request for help felt like admission of failure. "Why not you helped me? I said we should talk. You took me at my word." People say things. Doesn't mean they expect follow-through from strangers. Rebecca sipped her coffee, buying time to organize thoughts that had scattered the moment James walked in, looking like hope and disaster in equal measure. "I'm going to be direct because that's how I operate, and I think you'll appreciate it more than corporate dancing. I looked into you after the flight. Standard security protocol, nothing invasive, just basic due diligence. I know about Walker Ground Services, about the debt, about the foreclosure timeline." James's jaw tightened, but he didn't look away. Military discipline holding shame in check through sheer will. "If this is pity, it's not." The words came out sharper than intended. Rebecca softened her tone. "I don't do pity. It's a useless emotion that helps no one. What I do is pattern recognition. I see someone with military logistics experience, technical expertise, and community reputation trying to compete against corporations with resources he can't match. That's not a failure. That's asymmetric warfare with the wrong tools." She pulled a folder from her briefcase and slid it across the table. James opened it to find printouts. Torres Aviation financial statements, market analysis for Southeast Aviation Services, projected growth curves for the accessibility technology sector. Torres Aviation Technologies is expanding our ground services partnership network. We need reliable operators who understand that accessibility isn't special accommodation, it's baseline human decency. You demonstrated that understanding yesterday at 35,000 feet. James scanned the documents with focus that suggested he actually understood the numbers, not just performing engagement. When he looked up, his expression had shifted from defensive to cautious. "What exactly are you proposing?" $2.5 million investment in Walker Ground Services. Full facility upgrade, expand from 1 hangar to 3, modernize equipment scale from 5 employees to 25. You'd become our exclusive Southeast partner for ground operations with technology integration from our accessibility division. In exchange, I want you as Chief Operating Officer with equity stake, 40% ownership, base salary, 95,000 performance bonuses tied to customer satisfaction metrics rather than pure profit. The number hung between them like something physical. James set down his coffee with exaggerated care, as if sudden movement might shatter whatever reality had produced this conversation. "You're offering me a C-suite position based on a 5-hour flight and a background check." "No. I'm offering you a partnership based on judgment under pressure, values, alignment, and strategic opportunity." The flight just revealed what was already there. His hands had started trembling again. Not adrenaline this time, shock maybe, or the particular vertigo that came from having desperate prayers answered in ways that made them feel like traps. "Ms. Torres, Rebecca, I can't accept this." The refusal landed like ice water. Rebecca had anticipated hesitation, negotiation, possibly demands for better terms. Outright rejection hadn't been on her probability matrix. "Why not?" "Because you're making this decision based on emotion, not business. I'm a mechanic who knows ground operations. I've never managed anything larger than a 5-person rotation. I don't have corporate experience, don't have the education, don't have anything that qualifies me to run a multi-million-dollar operation." Rebecca leaned back, studying him with the same intensity she'd brought to evaluating patent applications and acquisition targets. This wasn't false modesty. James genuinely believed he was unqualified, genuinely thought accepting help constituted moral failure. She'd felt exactly the same way when her first major investor had offered funding, had spent 3 weeks convincing herself it was charity, that real entrepreneurs didn't need outside capital, that accepting assistance meant admitting she couldn't succeed alone. It had taken her sister, blunt, uncompromising, furious, to point out that confusing pride with strength was just another form of self-sabotage. You led men in combat. You made life-and-death decisions in environments where mistakes meant casualties. You've run a business for 2 years with zero institutional support and kept it alive despite market forces designed to crush exactly your profile. And you demonstrated moral courage yesterday when everyone else chose comfortable silence. Rebecca's voice had gone quiet, but hard, the tone she used when board members questioned her strategic vision. Don't tell me you're not qualified, tell me you're scared, that I can work with. James's expression cracked just for a moment, and Rebecca saw beneath the defensive armor to the exhaustion and fear underneath. I have a daughter, 8 years old. If I take this and fail, I don't just lose my father's company, I lose her stability, her school, everything I've been trying to protect. There it was. The real objection stripped of professional rationalization. Rebecca understood that fear at cellular level, had felt it every time she pushed her company into new territory, risked everything on innovations the market insisted were impossible. Failing while trying is different than failing by default. Right now, you're on track to lose everything in 60 days. Taking this offer means you might fail, or you might build something that gives Angela opportunities you never had. Which risk scares you more? The question hung between them while James processed implications. Around them, the coffee shop filled with morning rush tech workers, grabbing artisanal espresso investors, checking phones, the ambient noise of a city built on calculated gambles. I need time to think, to review contracts, talk to my advisor, make sure this isn't... He stopped, searching for words. Too good to be true, Rebecca offered. I have that effect on people. Take 2 weeks. My legal team will draft formal agreements. You can have your own attorney review everything. This isn't a trap, James. It's business opportunity that happens to align with both our interests. 2 weeks. He nodded slowly. I can work with that. They finished coffee, discussing logistics, expansion timelines, employee retention technology, integration. James asked intelligent questions about supply chain management and customer acquisition, revealing business acumen buried under imposter syndrome and exhaustion. By the time they parted outside Presidio grounds, Rebecca felt cautiously optimistic. He'd refused her offer initially, which paradoxically made her more confident in the choice. People who accepted immediately were either desperate or mercenary. James was desperate but not mercenary, principled but not inflexible, exactly the combination she needed. Her phone rang as she walked back to the office. Melissa Barnes, her COO, with the particular urgency that signaled problems. Rebecca, we have a situation. Patricia Caldwell just called an emergency board meeting for Friday. She's questioning the Atlanta investment before you've even made the offer official. Rebecca's jaw tightened. Patricia Caldwell, lead director, 62 years of venture capital experience and zero tolerance for what she perceived as emotional decision-making. They'd clashed before over Rebecca's tendency to invest in long-term capability building rather than quarterly optimization. On what grounds? Due diligence concerns. Apparently someone leaked that you're considering a major investment in an unknown ground services operator based on a chance meeting. Her exact words were, "Judgment clouded by personal gratitude." The leak could have come from anywhere. Too many people had access to preliminary research, too many analysts tracking acquisition patterns. What mattered was Patricia's framing. Personal gratitude, emotional compromise. The oldest weapon used against female executives, suggesting that sentiment had corrupted strategic thinking. Schedule the meeting. I'll present the full business case. They'll approve it. Melissa's silence carried skepticism. Patricia's already been making calls to other board members. She has support for divesting before we double down. Then I'll change their minds. Send me everything we have on Southeast market penetration and competitor analysis. I want numbers that make this look inevitable, not opportunistic. The call ended. Rebecca stood on the corner of Montgomery and Market watching San Francisco's financial district perform its morning choreography of ambition and capital. She'd fought board battles before, had won most of them through preparation and ruthless clarity about return on investment. But this was different. This wasn't just market expansion, it was proof of concept for a vision Patricia and the old guard had never fully bought into. The idea that investing in people conventional wisdom dismissed as risky could generate returns beyond shareholder value, could build loyalty and capability that quarterly reports couldn't capture. If the board voted to kill the Walker investment before it started, Rebecca lost more than one partnership. She lost momentum on transforming Torres Aviation from accessible technology vendor into something larger, a model for how corporations could do well by doing good. She couldn't afford to lose this fight. Thursday passed in a blur of financial modeling and strategic planning. Rebecca's team assembled presentation materials that would make Walker Ground Services look like the logical next step in calculated expansion rather than impulsive charity. Revenue projections, market analysis, competitive advantages created by technology integration, everything designed to appeal to board members who thought in basis points and risk-adjusted returns. Friday morning arrived with fog so thick it turned the city into impressionist painting. Rebecca dressed for war navy suit that cost more than most people's monthly rent, Louboutin heels modified to accommodate the prosthetic hair pulled back in a style that said she hadn't woken up thinking about appearance because she'd been thinking about domination. The board convened in Torres Aviation's 28th floor conference room. 9 directors plus Rebecca arranged around a table that had cost $40,000 because perception mattered in corporate governance. Patricia Caldwell sat at the opposite end, silver hair, perfect expression, neutral in a way that promised nothing good. Rebecca opened with financials projected 18-month break-even on the Walker investment, 36-month ROI of 240%, assuming moderate growth. Conservative estimates based on current market conditions and competitor performance. Patricia let her finish the presentation before striking. These numbers assume Walker Ground Services can scale successfully. What evidence suggests that's possible? We're talking about a company currently in default, run by someone with zero corporate management experience. Rebecca had anticipated this line of attack. James Walker has 10 years of military logistics experience managing high-stakes operations in hostile environments. He's kept his company solvent for 2 years despite aggressive predatory pricing from larger competitors. Customer satisfaction ratings exceed industry average by 22 percentage points. That suggests capability, not luck. Another board member, Thomas Chen, cleared his throat. With respect, military experience doesn't translate directly to corporate management. We've seen veteran-focused investments fail because combat skills don't map to P&L responsibility. You're right that direct translation is a myth. Rebecca pulled up a new slide comparison metrics between Walker's operational efficiency and industry benchmarks. But logistics expertise, personnel management under pressure, and crisis response absolutely translate. Walker's injury rate is 0. His employee retention is 100%. His on-time performance exceeds our current Southeast partners by 18%. Those aren't combat skills, they're leadership fundamentals. Patricia leaned forward, fingers steepled. Leadership aside, let's address the elephant in the room. You met this man on an airplane where he physically intervened in a confrontation involving you. That creates psychological bias. You feel grateful, possibly obligated, and you're rationalizing a risky investment as strategic opportunity. The accusation hung in the air like smoke. Rebecca felt anger spike hot and immediate forced it down through sheer will. Showing emotion now would confirm Patricia's narrative. I understand why it appears that way, but I've made every major decision in this company based on seeing value where others saw limitation. When I proposed accessibility-focused aviation technology, investors said the market was too small. We're now generating $600 million annually from that small market. When I suggested partnering with disability advocacy organizations for R&D board members worried about activism compromising profit, those partnerships produced our 3 most successful product lines. She met Patricia's gaze directly. My track record is built on trusting instinct backed by research. Walker Ground Services fits our expansion strategy perfectly. The timing is coincidental. The opportunity is real." Thomas spoke again, softer this time. "Rebecca, no one questions your vision. But this is a $2.5 million investment in an unknown operator based on limited due diligence. That's not instinct, that's gambling with shareholder money." "Then let me propose a compromise." Rebecca had prepared this fallback, hoping she wouldn't need it, but ready to deploy if necessary. Approval contingent on quarterly performance reviews. Clear KPIs around revenue growth, customer satisfaction, and operational efficiency. If Walker fails to meet benchmarks, we divest. That gives you protection, while giving the partnership room to prove itself. Patricia exchanged glances with other board members, silent communication that excluded Rebecca, despite this being her company, her vision, her fight. "The board will discuss and vote. You're excused, Rebecca." The dismissal was professional. Expected still felt like being sent from the principal's office. Rebecca stood with careful control, no sign of frustration, no hint of the rage building behind her sternum, and left her own conference room. Melissa waited outside, expression telegraphing concern. "How bad?" "Depends on whether Patricia convinces them I'm making decisions with my emotions instead of my brain." Rebecca pulled out her phone, checking for messages she knew wouldn't be there. "Any word from Walker?" "Nothing yet. You told him 2 weeks. It's been 2 days. Rebecca nodded, forcing herself to breathe normally. 2 days. James was probably still processing, talking to advisors, reviewing contracts, weighing risks against desperate hope. She couldn't rush him, couldn't push harder without confirming Patricia's accusation that this was about gratitude rather than business. But waiting felt like torture when the board might kill the opportunity before James even had chance to accept it. 30 minutes stretched into an hour. Rebecca paced her office, reviewing financials she'd already memorized, checking her phone compulsively for updates that refused to arrive. Outside her window, San Francisco performed its afternoon routine, ferries crossing the bay, traffic accumulating on the bridges, fog beginning its slow evening invasion from the Pacific. Her phone finally rang. Patricia's name on the caller ID. The board voted 7-2 in favor of continuing the Atlanta investment contingent on quarterly reviews and your commitment to delegate more operational oversight. Relief flooded through Rebecca's chest, followed immediately by suspicion. 7-2 was stronger support than she'd expected. What changed Patricia's mind? "I didn't say Patricia voted yes. I said the board approved. You have your partnership, Rebecca. Try not to make us regret it." The call ended. Rebecca sat in her office chair and allowed herself exactly 30 seconds of pure triumph. She'd won. The board had approved. Now she just needed James Walker to say yes. Her phone buzzed with a text from an unknown Atlanta number. "Ms. Torres, this is George Mitchell, advisor at Walker Ground Services. James asked me to reach out. We need to discuss the contract terms before he can make a final decision." "Available to talk," Rebecca typed back immediately. "Absolutely. When works for you." The response came fast. "Now if possible. James is at a difficult crossroads and the timeline matters." They arranged a video call for 30 minutes later. Rebecca used the time to pull George Mitchell's background. 30 years at Walker Ground Services, started as mechanic under James's father, promoted to senior advisor after the founder's death. Reputation for integrity and conservative financial management. If George was involved in the decision-making process that suggested James was taking this seriously. The video call connected at precisely the scheduled time. George Mitchell's face filled the screen. Silver hair, weathered features, eyes that had seen enough corporate promises to know which ones were real. "Ms. Torres, thank you for making time." "Of course. And it's Rebecca, please. What concerns do you have about the contract?" George didn't waste time on pleasantries. "I've been in this industry for 40 years, seen a lot of companies make promises about partnership and investment, then walk away when the numbers don't hit fast enough. James can't afford to bet Angela's future on good intentions. I need to understand what happens if this goes sideways." The question was fair-rooted in experience with corporate bad actors. Rebecca appreciated the directness. The contract includes performance-based milestones, but they're structured around sustainable growth, not quarterly optimization. We're measuring customer satisfaction, safety records, employee retention metrics that indicate long-term viability. If Walker hits benchmarks, the partnership continues. If he doesn't, we have a 90-day wind-down period to transition operations without destroying the business. And if Torres Aviation decides to pull out for reasons unrelated to performance, market shift, strategic pivot, whatever euphemism you want to use, then James keeps the equity stake and we buy out at fair market value based on independent assessment. He doesn't walk away empty-handed. George studied her through the screen, evaluating sincerity through pixels and bandwidth. Why are you doing this? Real reason, not the corporate strategy version. Rebecca considered deflecting, offering some sanitized explanation about market expansion and competitive advantage, but George Mitchell had earned honesty through 3 decades of keeping promises in an industry that rewarded cutting corners. Because I built this company after an accident that everyone said meant my life was over. People told me to accept limitations, adjust expectations, be realistic about what amputees could achieve in competitive industries. I proved them wrong by finding people who saw capability instead of disability, who invested in potential rather than pedigree. She paused, choosing words carefully. James reminds me of who I was 6 years ago. Someone with skills the market undervalues because they don't fit conventional profiles. I'm not saving him. I'm betting on him. There's a difference. Silence stretched between them. George's expression remained neutral, but something shifted in his eyes, assessment moving from skeptical to considering. James doesn't think he's qualified, keeps saying he's just a mechanic who got lucky with SEAL training. James is wrong, and part of my job is helping him see what I already know, that keeping a business alive for 2 years against predatory competition while raising a daughter alone requires more strategic thinking than most MBA programs teach. George nodded slowly. I'll tell him what you said. But the final decision is his. I can advise, but I won't push. He's had enough people pushing him toward choices that served their interests instead of his. Understood. And George, thank you for looking out for him. He's lucky to have that kind of loyalty. He's earned it. His father would be proud of the man he became, even if the business doesn't survive. I want to make sure that if he takes this leap, he lands somewhere solid. The call ended with promises to reconnect once James made his decision. Rebecca sat in the gathering darkness of her office, city lights beginning their evening performance beyond the windows. The waiting was its own kind of torture. She'd given James 2 weeks because rushing him would have violated the respect she'd promised, but every day that passed meant another day. Patricia and the skeptical board members could question the wisdom of this investment. Her phone buzzed. Text from James. Can we talk? Not about the contract. About something else. Rebecca's pulse quickened. She typed back, of course. Call whenever. The phone rang 30 seconds later. James's voice came through rough with exhaustion and something that might have been fear. I need you to understand something before I give you an answer. About what happened on the plane. Rebecca's chest tightened. Okay. I have PTSD. Been managing it since I got out, but it doesn't go away. High-stress situations trigger responses I can't always control. That's what happened with the flight attendants. I saw a threat and reacted with SEAL training before civilian judgment could override muscle memory. His breathing was audible over the connection. If I take this position and something similar happens, if I lose control in front of employees or customers, that reflects on your company, on you. I need you to know what you're signing up for. The vulnerability in his voice activated something fierce and protective in Rebecca's chest. He was giving her an exit, offering evidence against himself because he believed honesty mattered more than opportunity. James, I'm not signing up for a perfect employee. I'm partnering with a human being who has combat experience and the psychological cost that comes with it. If you need accommodations, therapy time, stress management protocols, whatever helps you do this job safely, we build that into the structure. That's not a liability. That's basic decency. Silence then. Most people don't see it that way. Most people don't build billion-dollar accessibility companies. I'm not most people. She heard him exhale long and shaky. I talked to Angela about it. Didn't give her details, just asked if she'd be okay with maybe moving to a bigger house someday, going to a better school. You know what she said? What? She asked if we'd still have pancake Saturdays, if I'd still tuck her in, if we'd still be us. His voice cracked slightly. Made me realize she doesn't care about the money or the opportunity. She just wants to make sure we're still family. Rebecca felt her eyes sting, blinked hard against unexpected emotion. That's a smart kid. She is. Smarter than me by miles. Another pause waited with decision. I'm saying yes, but I have conditions. Relief and triumph surged through Rebecca's chest. Name them. Equity stake at 40%, not 30%. George becomes partner, not advisor. All current employees guaranteed 3 years minimum employment. And I retain final say on hiring and firing. I won't manage a company where I don't control culture. Rebecca smiled despite herself. Done, 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 and done. Anything else? Yeah. One more thing. I need you to promise that if I screw this up, if PTSD or inexperience or whatever else makes me a liability, you'll fire me before I damage your company. Angela needs me to succeed, but she needs me to have integrity more. I won't let desperation turn me into someone who hangs on past the point where I'm helping. The request was so quintessentially James asking to be held accountable in the same breath as negotiating partnership terms that Rebecca had to take a moment before responding. I promise. And James, you're not going to screw this up. You don't know that. No, but I know you're the kind of person who asks for that promise, which tells me everything I need to know about whether you'll earn it. They talked for another 30 minutes about logistics, relocation, timeline, training schedule, employee announcements. James's voice gradually shed the defensive tension, settling into something that sounded almost like excitement. After the call ended, Rebecca sat in her dark office and allowed herself a moment of pure satisfaction. She'd won the board fight. James had accepted. The partnership would move forward despite every obstacle conventional wisdom had thrown in its path. Now came the hard part, proving that her instinct had been right, that investing in James Walker would generate returns her skeptics couldn't measure but couldn't deny. Monday morning brought James back to Atlanta with contracts in his briefcase and hope warring against terror in his chest. He drove directly from the airport to Walker Ground Services, where George waited in the office they'd shared since James's father died. I said yes. George looked up from paperwork that probably detailed exactly how close they were to losing everything. I know. Rebecca called me Saturday to coordinate contract details. Wanted to make sure the partner role was structured properly. You think I'm making a mistake? The question hung between them, while George set down his pen and studied James with the same expression he'd worn when teaching a much younger James how to diagnose transmission problems by sound alone. I think you're making a leap that terrifies you, which usually means it's the right choice. Safe decisions don't scare us. Important ones do. James sank into the chair across from George's desk, suddenly exhausted despite having slept on the flight. Dad would probably say I'm being reckless. Your father was a good man and a skilled mechanic, but he was also too stubborn to ask for help when he needed it. That stubbornness killed him, worked himself into a heart attack because accepting assistance felt like admitting defeat. George's voice gentled. You're not your father, James. You're allowed to build something different. The words settled over James like absolution for sins he hadn't known he was carrying. His father had built Walker Ground Services from nothing, had sacrificed health and time and peace of mind to create something that employed people and served the community. But he'd also died at 63, burned out and broke, leaving James with legacy wrapped in debt. Maybe there was another way. Maybe accepting help didn't mean dishonoring what his father had built. Maybe it meant finishing what he'd started. When do we tell the crew? Rebecca's team is drafting announcement materials. They want to coordinate messaging so employees hear it from us, not the rumor mill. Probably end of the week. James nodded, processing the reality that his life was about to change in ways he couldn't fully anticipate. Bigger facility, more employees, corporate oversight, technology, integration, partnership with a woman who'd seen something in him he still wasn't sure existed. His phone buzzed. Text from Angela sent from George's wife's phone, since 8-year-olds didn't have their own devices yet. "Daddy, when are you home? I finished the rocket and it's so cool," he typed back. "On my way now, baby. Can't wait to see it. Love you." 3 dots appeared then. "Love you more. Infinity +1. James smiled despite the anxiety still churning in his gut. Angela had invented infinity +1 when she was 5, her mathematical proof that her love exceeded quantifiable measure. He'd been deployed when she'd explained it to him over satellite phone, her voice tiny and distant but absolutely certain. Everything he did, every decision, every risk, every desperate gamble came back to making sure that little girl grew up, knowing her father fought for her with everything he had. "I need to get home. Angela's waiting." George stood and extended his hand. James shook it, feeling the calluses that matched his own, the strength that came from decades of honest work. "Your father would be proud, son. Not because you saved the company, because you had the courage to let someone help you save it." James drove home through Atlanta traffic that felt different somehow, as if the city had rearranged itself while he was gone. Same streets, same landmarks, but his relationship to them had shifted. He was no longer just another failing business owner counting days until foreclosure. He was a partner in something that might actually work, might actually grow into the legacy his father had dreamed about but never achieved. The house he rented on the south side of the city looked smaller than he remembered. 3 bedrooms, aging HVAC yard that needed attention he never had time to give it. But it was theirs, and Angela had friends in the neighborhood, and change meant disruption he'd been trying to spare her. She burst through the front door before he'd fully parked, braids flying rocket clutched in both hands like precious cargo. "Daddy, look, I added stabilizers and a recovery system with a parachute made from a garbage bag." James caught her in a hug that probably lasted longer than age-appropriate coolness allowed, but he didn't care. She was warm and solid and smelled like school cafeteria and the strawberry shampoo she insisted on using despite its tendency to tangle her hair. "That's amazing, baby. Want to show me how it works?" They spent the next hour in the backyard, Angela explaining rocket dynamics with 8-year-old certainty, while James listened and asked questions that made her eyes light up with the particular joy of being taken seriously. She launched the rocket 3 times, adjusting the angle and recovery system after each attempt, narrating her problem-solving process like she was presenting at NASA. Watching her, James felt something settle in his chest. This was why he'd said yes to Rebecca's offer. Not for himself, but for Angela. So she could attend schools that nurtured this brilliant, curious mind. So she could pursue aerospace engineering without wondering if they could afford the tuition. So she never had to watch her father work himself to death trying to maintain something that maybe wasn't meant to be maintained alone. After dinner, spaghetti that Angela helped make sauce from a jar because James's cooking skills peaked at boiling water, he tucked her into bed and sat on the edge of the mattress like he'd done every night since she was born. "Daddy, are we going to be okay?" The question caught him off guard, sharp and direct, in a way that reminded him she was more perceptive than he gave her credit for. "What makes you ask that? George's wife told me you were on a big trip. And you looked worried when you came home even though you were smiling." She studied him with eyes that were her mother's dark brown, impossibly deep-seeing more than they should. "Did something bad happen?" James took a breath, weighing honesty against protection, deciding that Angela deserved truth even when it was complicated. "Something good happened, actually. I met someone who wants to help our company grow. It means changes, maybe a new house, new school, new opportunities. But it also means I'll be learning a lot of new things, and sometimes that's scary for grown-ups too." "Is it the lady who helped you help her?" He blinked, thrown. "How did you know about that?" "George's wife told me you stood up for someone on the airplane, said you were brave." Angela's fingers played with the edge of her blanket, the nervous gesture she'd developed when processing big emotions. "Were you scared?" "Yeah, baby, I was scared." "But you did it anyway." "Yes." She nodded, apparently satisfied with this logic. "That's what Ms. Chen says bravery is. being scared but doing the right thing anyway. So if you're scared about the new stuff, that just means you're being brave again. James felt his throat tighten. 8 years old, and already wiser than he'd been at 30. You're pretty smart, you know that. I get it from you. She said it with absolute certainty, as if genetic inheritance explained everything. Are you going to say yes to the lady? I already did. Good. She sounds nice. And maybe if we have more money we can get a dog. I've been researching optimal breeds for families with limited yard space, and I think a medium-sized mixed breed would be statistically most compatible with our lifestyle. James laughed despite himself. We'll see. First we have to make sure this all works out. It will. You're good at fixing things. Angela yawned, eyes already drooping toward sleep. Love you, Daddy. Infinity +1. Love you more, baby. Infinity +2. She giggled at the escalation of their familiar game, then drifted off with the easy unconsciousness of children who believed their parents could protect them from anything. James sat in the darkening bedroom and watched his daughter sleep, feeling the weight of promises made and bets placed on futures he couldn't guarantee. Rebecca Torres had offered him a lifeline dressed as partnership had seen capability where everyone else saw liability. Now he had to prove her right while managing the terror that came from having something to lose again. His phone buzzed with an email notification. Contract documents from Torres Aviation's legal team, formal agreements that would transform $2.5 million from abstract concept into concrete obligation. James opened the attachments and started reading, making notes on clauses he didn't understand, questions he'd need answered before signing. The work absorbed him until past midnight, until his eyes burned and the shoulder ached with familiar intensity. But underneath the exhaustion lived something new, not quite hope too fragile for that label, but its precursor. The sense that maybe possibly with enough work and luck and grace he could build something worthy of the faith Rebecca had placed in him. Something worthy of Angela's infinite +1 love. Something that honored his father's memory without being destroyed by its weight. The contract sat on his kitchen table like promise and threat in equal measure. James stared at them in lamplight that turned the pages into landscapes of opportunity and obligation. 40% equity. Chief Operating Officer. Partnership with a woman who'd built an empire from a hospital bed and now believed he could help expand it. All he had to do was sign. Transform desperation into determination. Let someone help him carry the burden he'd been shooting alone. James picked up the pen, hesitated, then signed his name across the signature line. The ink dried quickly, making the decision permanent. No backing out now, no second-guessing the leap. He'd said yes to Rebecca Torres. Now he had to become the person she believed he already was. The expansion of Walker Ground Services happened faster than James thought possible. 3 weeks after signing the contracts, construction crews descended on the property adjacent to his single hangar, transforming dirt and concrete into something his father would have barely recognized. Steel frames rose against the Atlanta sky like promises being kept in real time. Rebecca's project managers worked with military precision, coordinating deliveries and installations with efficiency that made James's previous attempts at vendor negotiations look like amateur hour. George stood beside him, watching a crane position the framework for what would become their second hangar, shaking his head with something between amazement and disbelief. Your daddy spent 30 years building what we had. Rebecca Torres is tripling it in 3 months. Different resources. James tried to keep his voice neutral, but pride crept in anyway. This was happening. Actually happening. Not hope or projection, but physical reality emerging from blueprints. Different everything. George pulled a folded paper from his pocket, the employee announcement that would go out tomorrow morning. You ready for this? Once people know, there's no taking it back. James took the paper, reading words he'd already memorized. Partnership with Torres Aviation Technologies. Facility expansion. New positions available. Comprehensive benefits package. Training opportunities. The language was corporate, but the promise underneath was simple stability for people who'd stuck with Walker Ground Services through the lean times. Send it. The announcement hit inboxes at 8 the next morning. By 9, James's phone was ringing with calls from employees, equal parts excited and nervous. Danny Cooper, The former Marine who handled night logistics wanted to know if this meant they'd finally get the equipment upgrades he'd been requesting for 2 years. Sarah Chen, their newest hire, asked whether the expansion would include apprenticeship programs for people transitioning from military service. James answered each call with information he'd prepared, promises he could actually keep now that Torres Aviation's resources backed them. Yes to equipment. Yes to apprenticeships. Yes to health insurance that didn't require choosing between coverage and groceries. By afternoon, local news had picked up the story. Former Navy SEAL partners with accessibility tech giant to expand veteran-owned business. The narrative wrote itself, redemption and opportunity packaged for easy consumption. A reporter from the Atlanta Journal-Constitution called requesting an interview. James deflected to Rebecca's public relations team, not ready to perform optimism for cameras when he was still processing the vertigo of having something to lose again. Rebecca flew down that Friday for the official announcement and facility walkthrough. James met her at the airport, suddenly self-conscious about his truck's age and the fast food wrappers Angela had left in the back seat despite his instructions to clean up. Rebecca climbed into the passenger seat without comment, dressed in what James was learning to recognize as her working uniform, tailored slacks blouse in neutral tones, the kind of effortless professionalism that came from having staff who managed wardrobes. "How are the crews feeling about the changes?" "Cautiously optimistic. Nobody wants to believe good things are real until they've been real for a while." "Smart?" Rebecca checked her phone fingers, moving across the screen with practiced speed. "I'm the same way. Makes disappointment hurt less when you haven't fully committed to hope." The admission surprised James. He'd started thinking of Rebecca as someone who operated beyond normal human uncertainty, whose success insulated her from the doubts that plagued ordinary people. Hearing her acknowledge the same protective pessimism he carried made her suddenly more real, more accessible. They drove to Walker Ground Services through Atlanta traffic that gave James time to point out landmarks: the diner where he and Angela had pancake Saturdays, the elementary school where she was currently revolutionizing fourth-grade science fair projects, the park where he'd taught her to ride a bike one summer while managing panic attacks triggered by the intersection of fatherhood and PTSD. Rebecca listened without performing polite interest, asking questions that suggested genuine curiosity about lives lived outside boardrooms and investor presentations. By the time they reached the facility, James felt something shift between them, partnership becoming something that might eventually resemble friendship. The construction site swarmed with activity. Electricians running conduit, HVAC, specialists installing climate control systems, framers finishing the skeleton of what would house 8 times their current capacity. George emerged from the original hangar and made his way over, extending a hand to Rebecca. "Ms. Torres, good to finally meet in person." "Rebecca, please. And thank you for keeping this operation running while James and I worked out the details. The due diligence reports made it clear you're the operational backbone here." George's weathered face colored slightly at the praise. "Just doing what I've always done, though I'll admit the budget you're working with makes things considerably easier." They toured the expansion together, Rebecca asking technical questions that revealed deeper understanding of ground operations than James had expected from a CEO. She knew the difference between tow bar and pushback configurations, understood why apron positioning mattered for efficiency, caught a potential safety issue with equipment staging that the construction foreman had missed. "You've done this work before." James made it a statement rather than question. "Summer internship during college. Thought I wanted to be a pilot until I discovered air sickness was a career-limiting condition. Ended up in ground ops for a regional carrier, learned more about aviation logistics in 3 months than 4 years of business school taught me about management." Another piece of the puzzle that was Rebecca Torres clicking into place. Not just a CEO who'd built an empire through vision and determination, but someone who'd worked the same jobs James's crews performed, who understood that operational excellence started with respecting the people doing the actual work. The afternoon culminated in a meeting with Walker's 5 current employees, introducing Rebecca formally and outlining expansion plans. James watched his crew assess her with the particular wariness that came from having seen corporate promises evaporate before. But Rebecca didn't perform inspiration or deliver platitudes about being a family. She laid out concrete timelines, specific commitments, and the metrics by which success would be measured. I'm not here to make you feel good about this partnership. I'm here to make it profitable for everyone involved. That means investing in equipment and training, but it also means holding ourselves to higher standards than the competition. James and George set those standards. My job is providing resources to meet them consistently. Danny Cooper, never one to hold back hard questions, raised his hand. What happens if the numbers don't work out? If we expand and the business doesn't grow fast enough to justify the investment? Rebecca didn't hesitate. Then we have 90 days to right-size operations without destroying what you've built. I'm not in the business of making promises I can't keep, but I am in the business of betting on capability over pedigree, and this crew has demonstrated capability that deserves investment. The answer satisfied Danny enough to nod, which seemed to satisfy the others. The meeting ended with cautious agreement that this might actually work, that maybe Torres Aviation's resources could transform Walker Ground Services into something his father had never imagined possible. After the employees dispersed, George pulled James aside. She's the real thing. Not just corporate money playing at caring, she actually understands what we do here. I know. James watched Rebecca examine equipment manifests with one of the construction managers, pointing out specifications that needed adjustment. Makes it more terrifying somehow, like we actually have to deliver now. You will. You've been delivering with nothing. Wait until you see what you can do with actual support. The next 6 weeks blurred together in controlled chaos. James split time between Atlanta and San Francisco learning corporate systems that felt like foreign languages at first, procurement protocols, HR compliance, financial modeling that went beyond checking whether the bank account could cover payroll. Rebecca's team provided training that was simultaneously comprehensive and overwhelming, cramming an MBA's worth of knowledge into compressed time frames that left James's head spinning. But slowly, painfully, it started making sense. The logistics training from his SEAL years provided unexpected foundation for supply chain management. Personnel experience from leading combat teams translated to hiring strategies and performance metrics. The discipline that had kept him alive in hostile territories now kept him focused through 18-hour days of learning systems designed for people with very different educational backgrounds. Angela noticed the changes even if she couldn't articulate them precisely. He was gone, more present, less distracted when he was home. She adapted with the resilience of children who'd already learned that love didn't guarantee availability, drawing rockets in the margins of his work papers and leaving notes that said things like, "You're doing great, Daddy," in crayon on his laptop. George's wife, Patricia, picked up the slack without complaint, managing school drop-offs and homework supervision, while James learned to navigate a world that operated on conference calls and quarterly projections. He owed them both debts he couldn't quantify, kindness that didn't appear on balance sheets but made everything else possible. The grand opening was scheduled for mid-December, timed to capture year-end press coverage and position Walker Ground Services as a feel-good story heading into the holidays. Rebecca's PR team orchestrated details with precision that felt excessive until James saw the results. Local news coverage, trade publication features, social media campaigns that positioned the partnership as proof that corporate investment in veteran-owned businesses generated returns beyond shareholder value. The facility transformation was complete by then. 3 hangars where there'd been 1, 25 employees where there'd been 5. Equipment that represented more capital investment than James's father had seen in 3 decades. The numbers felt surreal every time James reviewed them, wealth measured in assets and capability rather than the desperate arithmetic of whether they could make payroll. The day before the grand opening, James walked through the empty facility alone. Morning light filtered through industrial windows, casting shadows that turned the space into a cathedral of possibility. His father had built the original hangar in 1978, every beam and bolt a testament to belief that honest work and fair dealing could sustain a family. Now that foundation supported something larger, something his father probably wouldn't recognize but might appreciate for what it represented, legacy not preserved but evolved. James's phone rang. Rebecca's name on the caller ID. "You ready for tomorrow?" "Ready as I'll ever be." James leaned against a workbench that had been his father's wood worn smooth by decades of use. Feels strange, like I'm waiting for someone to realize this was all a mistake and take it back. Imposter syndrome, extremely common among people who've achieved something they previously thought impossible. I felt it for 2 years after Torres Aviation hit its first $100 million in revenue. Kept thinking someone would audit the books and discover I'd accidentally committed fraud through sheer incompetence. The admission helped marginally, knowing that even Rebecca, who projected confidence like it was her primary job description, struggled with the same doubts, made them feel less like personal failing. What made it stop? It didn't completely. I just got better at ignoring it. Eventually, you accumulate enough evidence that you're actually qualified, that the voice questioning your competence gets drowned out by reality. They talked for another 20 minutes about tomorrow's logistics press talking points, contingency plans if weather forced the outdoor portion inside. Professional conversation that nonetheless carried undertones of something else, some developing connection that defied easy categorization. After the call ended, James remained in the empty facility, processing the strange truth that his life had been completely restructured in less than 3 months. Same city, same daughter, same fundamental reality, but everything else transformed by partnership with a woman who'd seen potential where he'd only recognized desperation. The grand opening drew crowds that exceeded even Rebecca's optimistic projections. City council members seeking photo opportunities. Competing ground services companies trying to assess whether Walker represented legitimate threat or flash-in-pan publicity stunt. Veterans organizations celebrating one of their own achieving success. Media capturing footage for segments about economic development and corporate responsibility. Angela cut the ceremonial ribbon wearing her best dress and the kind of serious concentration she usually reserved for rocket launches. The cameras loved her, 8 years old, with scientific vocabulary and unshakable belief that her father could accomplish anything. James watched her perform for the press and felt pride war with anxiety about what happened when the attention faded and they had to deliver on all these promises. Rebecca gave a speech that threaded the needle between corporate messaging and genuine emotion, talking about accessibility and opportunity without making either concept feel like charity. She positioned the Walker partnership as strategic investment in capability proof that doing well and doing good weren't mutually exclusive. Success isn't measured only in quarterly returns. It's measured in lives changed, communities strengthened, and possibilities created for people the market insisted weren't worth the risk. James Walker is proof that the market is wrong more often than it admits. The line got picked up by every news outlet covering the event, became a social media moment that generated more publicity than Rebecca's PR team had projected. By evening, Walker Ground Services was trending regionally, the story of veteran-turned-CEO partnering with accessibility tech Billionaire hitting enough cultural touchstones to achieve viral momentum. James endured it all with the stoicism he'd learned from handling media attention in military contexts, smile, answer questions, deflect credit to the team. But underneath the performance, terror churned. They'd built something that now had to actually work, had to generate the returns Rebecca's board expected, had to justify the faith she'd placed in him. The party wound down as December darkness fell. Employees dispersed to families and celebrations. Press packed equipment and chased the next story. Within hours, the facility that had hosted hundreds of people returned to industrial silence. Rebecca found James in the original hangar, sitting on the workbench where his father used to review repair orders. Successful launch. Thanks to your team, I just showed up and tried not to embarrass anyone. You did considerably more than that. The employees respect you. The press believes the story. And the contracts we signed this week put us ahead of 6-month revenue projections. Rebecca settled onto the workbench beside him, close enough that he could smell her perfume, something expensive and subtle that probably had a French name he couldn't pronounce. You're allowed to feel good about this, James. You earned it. I signed papers. You did everything else. I provided capital and infrastructure. You provided the foundation worth building on. Stop diminishing your contribution just because it doesn't fit your narrative of unworthiness. The accusation landed harder than James expected, sharp enough to cut through the defensive minimization he'd been performing all day. "Is that what I'm doing?" "Yes, and I recognize it because I did the same thing for years. Couldn't accept that I'd built something valuable because accepting success meant accepting vulnerability, meant having something to lose. Easier to stay small and cynical than to risk believing you deserved good outcomes." James looked at her. Really looked, not the professional assessment he'd been performing since they met, but genuine seeing. Rebecca Torres, at 30, had built an empire from hospital bed sketches, had survived betrayal and physical trauma, had chosen to invest in broken things because she understood that broken didn't mean worthless. And she was sitting on his father's workbench in a facility she'd funded, telling him to stop sabotaging his own success. How do you turn that off? The voice that says this is temporary, that any minute someone's going to realize you don't belong here. You don't turn it off. You just practice believing the evidence over the doubt. And you surround yourself with people who see you clearly enough to call bullshit when you start minimizing. The moment stretched between them, weighted with things neither was quite ready to name. Then Rebecca's phone buzzed, shattering the intimacy with the intrusion of board members and quarterly reviews. "I need to take this. But James, tomorrow morning when you wake up, you're still going to be the COO of an expanding company with employees depending on you. That's not charity or luck. That's what you built. Try to remember that." She left to take the call, heels clicking against concrete. James sat alone in the hangar his father had built and tried to practice believing that he deserved to be here. The weeks following the grand opening tested that belief in ways James hadn't anticipated. Success bred attention, and attention revealed vulnerabilities. Walker Ground Services landed 3 major contracts within a month, regional carriers looking for ground operations that could deliver Torres Aviation's accessibility standards alongside competitive pricing. Each contract represented validation proof that the partnership model worked, but it also meant scaling faster than James had projected, hiring employees he didn't know, trusting systems he'd barely learned to operate. The 5-person crew that had felt like family expanded to 25 strangers who brought different expectations and capabilities. Managing that growth required skills. His SEAL training hadn't covered conversations about performance and accountability that felt uncomfortably corporate. George handled much of the operational scaling, but even his 3 decades of experience struggled with the pace. They needed additional management layer, someone between James's strategic oversight and the crew's daily execution. The job posting went up in January, attracting applications from candidates whose resumes made James feel even more fraudulent. One name kept appearing in conversations with Rebecca's HR team, someone with ground operations experience at major carriers, corporate management credentials, and glowing recommendations from industry veterans. Richard Thornton's former operations director available because Thornton Aero Services had undergone restructuring that eliminated his position. The name Thornton sent warnings through James's nervous system. His father's old rival, the man who'd spent 20 years trying to eliminate Walker Ground Services through predatory pricing and strategic contract theft. Hiring someone from Thornton's organization felt like inviting a spy into the operation. But Rebecca's HR director made the case with data James couldn't easily dismiss. The candidate, Michael Barrett, 42, 15 years of experience, had resigned from Thornton rather than participate in practices he considered unethical. Had documentation of raising concerns about safety violations that were ignored in pursuit of cost-cutting. Came with references from employees who described him as principled to the point of career damage. James scheduled the interview with reservations he couldn't fully articulate. Barrett arrived exactly on time, dressed professionally but not ostentatiously, carrying a portfolio that suggested preparation without desperation. They talked for 90 minutes. Barrett was direct about his time at Thornton Aero Services, didn't sugarcoat the company's culture or his reasons for leaving. Richard Thornton runs operations like it's still 1995, compete on price, cut corners on safety, treat employees like replaceable parts. I stayed longer than I should have because I thought I could change it from inside. Eventually realized I was just enabling practices I couldn't ethically support. Why, Walker? You could work for any major carrier with your credentials. Barrett's expression shifted, vulnerability replacing professional polish. Because I watched Thornton try to destroy this company for 2 decades. Watched your father keep operating with integrity even when it cost him contracts. When I saw you'd partnered with Torres Aviation, saw the expansion plans, I thought maybe there's a chance to prove the old model doesn't have to win, that treating people right can be profitable. The answer resonated with something James recognized: the desire to prove that doing right mattered even when the market punished it. He offered Barrett the position that afternoon, pending background checks that came back clean within 48 hours. Barrett started the following Monday and immediately demonstrated why Thornton had been foolish to let him go. He streamlined scheduling systems, identified equipment redundancies, implemented training protocols that reduced errors without slowing operations. Within 2 weeks, efficiency metrics improved by 12%, while employee satisfaction surveys showed increased confidence in management. James began delegating operational oversight with relief that felt like exhaling after months of holding his breath. Barrett was competent in ways that freed James to focus on strategic development, on building relationships with clients who wanted accessibility guarantees Torres Aviation could provide. Everything was working. Revenue exceeded projections. Employees were thriving. The board's quarterly review came back with cautious approval and reduced oversight requirements. James started sleeping through the night for the first time since Angela was born, which is when Richard Thornton made his move. The first sign came via Danny Cooper, who pulled James aside after a routine safety meeting. "Boss, something weird happened. Regional Aviation called yesterday asking about our safety record. Specifically asked if we'd had any incidents involving management losing control. Used those exact words, losing control." James's chest tightened. "What did you tell them?" "That our safety record is perfect," which is true, but the question felt targeted, like someone fed them specific language. The second sign arrived through Barrett, who'd maintained relationships with former Thornton employees. One reached out with a warning. Thornton was shopping a story to aviation trade publications about James's altercation with flight attendants, framing it as evidence of PTSD-driven instability that made him unsafe in operational management. The story wasn't false exactly. James had physically intervened on the flight, had demonstrated controlled violence in front of witnesses. The incident report existed in TechAir's records, accessible to anyone who knew where to look and how to frame the narrative. Thornton was weaponizing James's worst fear, that his PTSD would be used to discredit his capability, that one moment of protecting someone would define him as dangerous rather than principled. James sat in his office staring at Barrett's warning message, feeling familiar panic start its slow crawl up his spine. His hands began shaking, the tremor that preceded full anxiety attacks. The walls felt closer, the air thinner. Combat flashbacks mixing with civilian dread, creating a feedback loop that made breathing difficult. His phone rang. "Rebecca." "James, I just got a call from a fact-checker at Aviation Week asking about the flight incident. They're running a story about veteran-owned businesses and operational safety. I need you to tell me what they're referring to." The shame that had been building since Danny's warning crystallized into something solid and choking. Rebecca was about to hear the worst version of the story, filtered through Thornton's malice and James's own conviction that he was fundamentally unsuited for civilian leadership. "The flight where we met. After you got off there was an incident report filed. The captain documented my intervention with the flight attendants. I thought it was resolved, but apparently Thornton got access to the report and is using it to question my fitness for managing operations." Silence stretched across the connection. James imagined Rebecca recalculating risk-running scenarios where this partnership became more liability than asset. "Did you assault anyone on that flight?" "I used defensive techniques to stop a flight attendant from putting hands on me first. Controlled redirection. No injury, nothing that rose to the level of charges. But it demonstrated SEAL training in a way that probably scared people." "James, look at me." He realized she'd switched the call to video. Her face filled the screen, expression serious but not angry. "Did you lose control?" "No, that's what scares me. I was completely in control, which means I'm capable of violence in situations where normal people would just not be." You're capable of protecting yourself and others using skills most people don't have. That's not the same as being unstable." Rebecca's voice carried absolute certainty. "Thornton is trying to turn your capability into liability because he knows we're a threat. This is a tactic, not a truth. But if the story runs, then we get ahead of it. I'm calling our PR team now. We're going to release a statement about the flight incident that frames it accurately. You intervened to protect a passenger experiencing harassment. The airline's own captain documented that you acted appropriately under the circumstances. We're not hiding from this, James. We're owning it as evidence of character rather than instability." The panic that had been building started to recede, not vanishing but becoming manageable. Rebecca wasn't abandoning him, wasn't using this as excuse to exit the partnership. She was fighting back. "Thornton won't stop here. If this doesn't work, he'll find something else. Then we make him irrelevant. We build Walker Ground Services into such an obvious success that his attacks look like what they are desperate attempts by a failing competitor." They spent the next hour coordinating response strategy. Rebecca's legal team would review the incident report, ensure nothing in James's actions constituted legitimate grounds for questioning his qualifications. The PR team would draft statements positioning James's intervention as proof of leadership under pressure. And Rebecca herself would call board members, preemptively framing Thornton's attack as validation that Walker was disrupting the market enough to threaten entrenched players. The story ran 2 days later in Aviation Week. The headline made James's stomach drop: "Veteran-owned aviation services when PTSD meets operational responsibility." But the article itself was more balanced than the headline suggested, thanks to Rebecca's team providing context. It covered the flight incident but included statements from the passenger. James had defended Rebecca herself, identified as Torres Aviation's CEO, describing his intervention as appropriate and necessary. The airline captain's report supported the narrative. By the time the piece addressed PTSD and veteran employment, it had established enough credibility to James's character that the questions felt more like advocacy for better veteran support than accusations of unfitness. Still, damage was done. 2 clients called requesting meetings to discuss safety protocols. A supplier asked pointed questions about management stability. The whisper campaign Thornton had started achieved its goal, planting doubt where there'd been confidence. James wanted to find Thornton and handle this the way his SEAL training suggested: direct confrontation, overwhelming force, eliminate the threat permanently. The impulse terrified him precisely because it felt so appealing, because some part of him believed that violence was the only language certain people understood. George found him in the parking lot that evening, standing beside his truck with keys in hand, but no ability to make himself get in and drive home. "You're thinking about doing something stupid." Not a question. George had known James since childhood, had watched him process his father's death and his wife's loss, understood the particular way James's brain defaulted to tactical solutions when emotional problems became overwhelming. "He's attacking my ability to provide for Angela, using my PTSD as weapon, and I'm supposed to just, write strongly worded emails. You're supposed to beat him by succeeding, by proving every one of his accusations wrong through results he can't dispute." George's voice carried the weight of 3 decades watching businesses destroy each other. "Your father tried to fight Thornton directly once, nearly bankrupted us in legal fees. You know what finally made Thornton back off? When we landed the Delta contract by being better, not by being louder. Dad never had someone weaponizing his mental health. No, he had someone spreading rumors about safety violations that weren't true, about kickbacks he never took, about practices he never engaged in. It's the same game, James. Thornton finds vulnerabilities and exploits them. You fighting him directly just confirms his narrative that you're unstable." James wanted to argue, wanted to insist that this was different, that his daughter's future was at stake in ways his father had never faced. But George was right, had always been right about the long game, about building something that outlasted immediate provocations. "What do? You go home to Angela, you show up tomorrow and do excellent work, and you trust Rebecca to handle the corporate warfare while you focus on operations. That's what partnership means, playing to strengths instead of trying to do everything alone." James drove home through Atlanta, darkness hands steady on the wheel through sheer force of will. Angela was asleep when he arrived, Patricia having handled the evening routine. He stood in his daughter's doorway watching her breathe this small human who trusted him completely, despite all evidence that the world was designed to punish trust. A crayon drawing lay on her nightstand, James and Rebecca standing in front of 3 hangars, Angela between them holding their hands. She'd labeled it "my family business" in purple marker, the possessive pronoun doing work she probably didn't intend. Family. As if Rebecca had become integrated into Angela's understanding of who mattered, who contributed to their lives in ways that transcended employment contracts and equity stakes. James picked up the drawing and carried it to his bedroom, studying the way Angela had rendered Rebecca taller than accurate, standing close to James, with a smile that seemed genuinely warm. An 8-year-old's interpretation of partnership that felt more honest than any corporate documentation could capture. His phone buzzed with a text from Rebecca. "Board meeting tomorrow. They want to discuss Thornton's attacks. I'm not worried. You shouldn't be either. We have the numbers on our side." He typed back, "Thank you for fighting for this, for us." 3 dots appeared, disappeared, appeared again. Then, partners fight for each other. That's non-negotiable. James set the phone down and tried to believe that partnerships could survive corporate warfare, that Rebecca's confidence wasn't misplaced, that he wasn't about to lose everything he'd started to hope was permanent. Sleep came in fragments, interrupted by dreams that mixed combat scenarios with board meetings where enemies wore suits instead of carrying weapons, but the threat felt equally lethal. The board meeting happened via video conference, Rebecca in San Francisco, while James joined from Atlanta. Patricia Caldwell's face filled the screen with the kind of neutral expression that promised uncomfortable questions. Rebecca, the Aviation Week piece has generated concern among investors about the Walker partnership, specifically whether proper due diligence was conducted regarding James's psychological fitness for operational management. Rebecca's expression didn't shift. James's PTSD diagnosis was part of the background check we ran before making the investment offer. We consulted with veteran employment specialists who confirmed that managed PTSD doesn't preclude operational excellence. In fact, many veterans with PTSD demonstrate exceptional crisis management skills because they're trained to maintain control under extreme stress. But the incident on the flight was James protecting a passenger from harassment, which the airline's own captain documented as appropriate intervention. The fact that Richard Thornton is weaponizing it as evidence of instability tells us more about Thornton's ethics than James's capabilities. Rebecca pulled up a slide showing Walker's operational metrics since the expansion. 0 safety incidents, 12% efficiency improvement. Customer satisfaction scores 20 points above industry average. Employee retention at 100%. Those are the numbers that matter, not Thornton's smear campaign. Thomas Chen spoke up. With respect, Rebecca, numbers don't address the fundamental question, what happens during a crisis if James's PTSD is triggered? James felt his chest constrict. This was it, the moment where his diagnosis became more important than his demonstrated capability, where past trauma outweighed present performance. But Rebecca's voice cut through his spiral with absolute certainty. Then James will handle it the same way he's handled every crisis since we partnered with competence, judgment, and leadership that most neurotypical managers struggle to demonstrate under pressure. PTSD doesn't make him less qualified. It makes him someone who's already survived and processed trauma most people can't imagine. That's not a liability. That's a strength we'd be foolish to waste because we're uncomfortable with diagnoses we don't understand. The silence that followed felt heavy with evaluation. Patricia exchanged glances with other board members, that same silent communication that had preceded their initial approval. The board maintains its support for the Walker Partnership contingent on continued positive performance metrics. But Rebecca, we're directing you to implement additional oversight protocols, monthly reviews instead of quarterly direct reporting on any incidents that might impact operational safety, and requirement that James undergo regular fitness evaluations. Rebecca's jaw tightened, but she nodded. Understood. Though I want it noted that we don't impose similar requirements on neurotypical executives. which suggests this is more about discomfort with disability than genuine risk management. The meeting ended with uncomfortable acknowledgement that the partnership would continue, but under increased scrutiny. James unmuted himself after the board disconnected. "I'm sorry, this is because of me. This is because Thornton is playing dirty and the board is risk-averse. Neither of those things is your fault." Rebecca rubbed her temples, exhaustion breaking through professional polish. "But James, I need you to do something for me. Anything. Stop apologizing for existing, stop treating your PTSD like moral failing, and start believing that you're not here despite your diagnosis. You're here because everything you've survived made you exactly who we need." The words landed somewhere James didn't have language for, in the space where shame and hope competed for dominance. Rebecca Torres, CEO of a billion-dollar company, was telling him his damage was valuable, that survival had meaning beyond just continuing to breathe. "I don't know how to do that." "Practice. Same way you practiced everything else you learned that felt impossible at first." Her expression softened. "We're going to win this, James. Thornton just made the mistake of his life by going after you publicly. Now we get to demonstrate that attacking veterans for having PTSD is not just unethical, it's bad business." They spent the next week implementing strategy that felt like controlled escalation. Rebecca's team reached out to veteran advocacy organizations, framing Thornton's attack as example of employment discrimination that needed public attention. Disability rights groups picked up the narrative, positioning Walker Ground Services as proof that accessibility investment generated returns while honoring human dignity. The counter-narrative built momentum faster than James expected. Within days, Thornton Aero Services faced uncomfortable questions about their own employment practices, their safety record, their history of predatory pricing. Aviation Week ran a follow-up piece examining how Thornton had treated veteran employees, uncovering pattern of hiring for publicity, then marginalizing when PTSD accommodations became inconvenient. Thornton's business began bleeding contracts. 2 major carriers switched to Walker Ground Services, specifically citing commitment to veteran employment and accessibility standards. Regional operators who'd stayed loyal to Thornton started requesting proposals from competitors. James watched it happen with mixture of satisfaction and discomfort. This was corporate warfare performed at levels he barely understood. Rebecca wielding publicity and advocacy the way his SEAL team had wielded tactical superiority. Effective, devastating, and completely beyond his personal capabilities to orchestrate, but also exhausting. Every news cycle brought fresh attention, fresh scrutiny, fresh pressure to perform gratitude and inspiration for cameras that wanted redemption stories with clear heroes and villains. James wasn't sure he qualified, as either wasn't comfortable with the narrative emerging of veteran CEO overcoming PTSD through partnership with visionary Billionaire. He tried saying this to Rebecca during one of their increasingly frequent late-night phone calls, conversations that had stopped being purely professional weeks ago without either acknowledging the shift. "I'm not inspiring. I'm just trying to keep my head above water while people treat my survival as entertainment. Welcome to being a public figure in a culture that consumes stories faster than it processes their implications." Rebecca's voice carried empathy earned through her own experience with media attention. "It gets easier, or you get numb to it. I haven't decided which." "How do you handle it? Being the face of a company while people reduce you to your prosthetic leg?" "I remind myself that their reductionism is their problem, not mine. That I built something valuable regardless of what narratives people project onto it. And I surround myself with people who see me clearly enough to call me on my bullshit when I start believing my own press." "Like who?" "Like you, actually. You've never treated me like inspiration porn or corporate savior. Just a person who happens to run a company and have a disability. That's rarer than you'd think." The admission created an intimacy that felt dangerous, that crossed boundaries James hadn't realized they'd been maintaining. He should probably say something professional, redirect the conversation to safer territory. Instead, he heard himself ask, "What happened with your ex after the accident?" Rebecca was silent long enough that James thought he'd crossed a line she wasn't willing to discuss. Then, "He stayed for 6 months, kept saying all the right things about supporting me through recovery. But I could see him calculating every time I struggled with something that used to be easy. whether this was worth the inconvenience, whether loving me was more burden than he'd signed up for. Finally, I told him to leave before his resentment poisoned what was left of my dignity. I'm sorry. Don't be. It clarified something important, that I'd rather be alone than with someone who saw me as damaged goods. Losing him hurt less than keeping him would have. A pause waited with things unsaid. You're different, though. You see capability instead of limitation. That's why I invested in Walker, and why I keep taking your calls at midnight when I should be sleeping. James's heart rate increased, adrenaline response triggered by vulnerability instead of danger. They were edging toward acknowledgement of something neither had named, toward territory that complicated partnership with implications James wasn't sure he was ready to process. Rebecca. You don't have to say anything. I'm not asking for response or commitment. Just want you to know that this, she gestured vaguely, encompassing everything between them, matters to me beyond the quarterly reports. The call ended shortly after leaving James sitting in darkness, trying to parse the difference between gratitude and something more complicated. Rebecca had given him everything: financial stability, professional opportunity, belief that he was worthy of investment. Developing feelings for her felt inevitable and impossible in equal measure, like standing at the edge of a cliff and considering flight. He wasn't ready to jump, wasn't sure he'd survive the landing, but increasingly wasn't sure he could keep standing still either. 3 months into the partnership, Walker Ground Services employed 40 people across 3 facilities. Revenue had exceeded projections by 18%. Safety record remained perfect. Employee satisfaction surveys showed culture ratings that made Thornton Aero Services look like cautionary tale in contrast. And Richard Thornton was quietly selling his company to a private equity firm, retiring from the industry that had consumed his father and nearly consumed him. James heard the news from Barrett, who still maintained contacts throughout the aviation services sector. Thornton's done, selling for a fraction of what the company was worth 5 years ago. Private equity will probably strip it for parts and dissolve what's left. Good. The vindication felt hollow somehow, victory against an opponent who'd self-destructed as much as been defeated. James, there's something else. Thornton's attorney reached out asking if you'd be willing to meet with him. Private, no lawyers present. Says Thornton wants to talk before he leaves the industry. Every instinct James possessed screamed trap. Meeting alone with the man who'd spent months trying to destroy his credibility felt like stupidity disguised as magnanimity. But something in Barrett's tone suggested this mattered, that understanding Thornton's motivations might matter for reasons James couldn't yet articulate. Set it up. Public location, daytime. Nothing that could be misconstrued as confrontation. They met at a coffee shop in downtown Atlanta, neutral territory, without associations for either of them. Thornton arrived looking diminished, the confidence that had animated their earlier encounter replaced by something that looked like exhaustion. James ordered black coffee and waited, letting Thornton navigate whatever brought him here. I owe you an apology. Thornton's voice carried weight that suggested the words cost him. What I did, the smear campaign about your PTSD that crossed lines I knew were wrong even while I was doing it. Then why do it? Because you represented everything I couldn't be. My father killed himself after losing to yours in a contract dispute that destroyed our family financially. I grew up believing the Walkers had ruined us, that competing meant survival. When you partnered with Torres Aviation, when you started succeeding, it proved that maybe the problem wasn't your family. Maybe it was mine. Maybe my father failed because he built a company on cutting corners and resentment instead of quality and integrity. The confession hung between them. James processed the revelation that Thornton's attacks hadn't been strategic calculation, but trauma response pain metabolized into aggression against a target that represented everything he'd lost. Your father's death wasn't my father's fault. Business competition didn't make him pull the trigger. I know that now. Took losing everything to finally see it clearly. Thornton stared into his coffee like it contained answers. I'm selling the company and getting help. Therapy, actual processing instead of just burying trauma under operational focus. Probably should have done it 15 years ago. Probably. James softened his tone. For what it's worth, I understand impulse toward violence when everything feels out of control. Understand defaulting to tactics that feel like strength, but are actually just fear dressed up as action. Thornton looked up, recognition passing between them. Two men shaped by trauma, choosing different paths, but understanding the same foundational reality that unprocessed pain became poison unless you found ways to metabolize it into something other than destruction. You're going to succeed, Walker, not because Torres Aviation gave you money, but because you actually give a damn about people. That matters more than I wanted to admit. They parted without dramatic reconciliation or promises of future friendship. Just two people who'd hurt each other finding enough common ground to stop the cycle. James drove back to Walker Ground Services feeling lighter somehow, as if Thornton's acknowledgement had released him from carrying grudges he hadn't realized were weighing him down. Rebecca was waiting in his office, unannounced visit that should have triggered concern, but instead felt like homecoming. "Barrett told me you met with Thornton. How did it go?" He apologized. Actually seemed to mean it. James settled into his desk chair, suddenly aware of how close they were in this small office, how the space that used to feel adequate now felt intimate. "Turns out he was fighting ghosts I didn't put there. Just happened to be standing where they landed." "That's generous considering what he put you through." "Generosity has nothing to do with it. I understand what it's like to have trauma control your behavior before you realize what's happening. Would be hypocritical to deny him the same grace I need." Rebecca studied him with an intensity that made James acutely conscious of his heartbeat, of the way her presence reorganized his awareness until everything else became peripheral. "You're a better person than most, James Walker." "I'm really not. Just someone who's made enough mistakes to recognize them in other people." She stood closing the distance between them until James had to look up to maintain eye contact. Her hand settled on his shoulder, the injured one, the place where shrapnel had carved permanent weakness into muscle and nerve. "I'm going to say something and you can ignore it if you want, but I need to say it anyway." James's throat went dry. "Okay. I'm falling for you. Have been since you stood up on that airplane without knowing who I was or what helping me might cost. And I know that complicates everything. Partnership, professional boundaries, the fact that you work for a company I own. But I'm tired of pretending this is purely business when my heart rate increases every time you call and I spend board meetings defending you with an intensity that has nothing to do with quarterly projections." The confession hung between them like a lit match near gasoline, potential energy, waiting for James's response to determine whether it ignited or extinguished. He stood slowly, bringing them to eye level, close enough to see gold flecks in her hazel eyes. "I've been terrified to feel this. Terrified of mixing gratitude with something deeper, of not being able to distinguish between owing you everything and wanting you for reasons that have nothing to do with what you've given me. And now I'm still terrified. But I'm also sure that what I feel has nothing to do with debt or obligation. You're brilliant and difficult and completely certain of yourself in ways that should intimidate me, but instead make me want to be better than I thought I could be." Rebecca's hand moved from his shoulder to his face, thumb tracing the line of his jaw with touch that felt simultaneously tentative and certain. "We should probably discuss professional implications, board reactions, the optics of CEO dating her COO. Probably." James leaned into her touch, surrendering to what they'd both been avoiding. "But maybe we could table that discussion until after I kiss you." "That seems reasonable." The kiss, when it came, felt like arrival and departure simultaneously, crossing a boundary they couldn't uncross, while stepping into territory neither had fully mapped. Rebecca tasted like coffee and certainty, her hands in his hair while his found the small of her back, pulling her closer until the space between them disappeared completely. They broke apart, breathing hard, foreheads pressed together while the office spun around them. "That was, yeah, we should probably, absolutely." Neither moved. The office had become its own universe, reality condensed to the space between their bodies, and the implications spiraling outward from this single decision. Rebecca's phone buzzed, shattering the moment. She checked the screen and laughed, the sound carrying surprise and delight. "It's Angela. She's asking if you're bringing Miss Rebecca to her science fair presentation on Friday." James felt his heart expand against his ribs. "How does she even have your number?" I gave it to her last month when I visited. Told her she could text me questions about engineering since you're clearly terrible at explaining propulsion systems. Rebecca showed him the message. Daddy says you're really smart about rockets. Will you come see mine? It's shaped like your company logo. That's... James couldn't finish the sentence around the emotion closing his throat. His daughter had internalized Rebecca as someone safe to reach out to, had incorporated her into their small family constellation without asking permission or announcing intentions. I'm going Friday. Obviously. Rebecca typed back a response, then looked at James with expression that held vulnerability he rarely saw her display. Unless you'd rather keep this us separate from Angela until we figure out what it is. Angela already figured out what it is. Apparently she's smarter than both of us. They stood in the office holding each other while Atlanta traffic hummed beyond the windows, and the future they'd been building separately transformed into something they might build together. Not simple, not uncomplicated, but real in ways that felt worth the risk.